We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! The video for today will be the part 6 of What If Naruto Traveled to the World of Harry Potter. The trust of a child is a fragile thing. Naruto becomes disenchanted with Konoha and the Sandaime Hokage when he stumbles upon the truth of who and what he is on his 8th birthday. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 20, Buying Permanency. Monday, November 5, 2001, morning. Konoha Gakur no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Harry kept his face a blank mask as he eyed the terrible state of the apartment that Naruto had lived in prior to setting out from Konoha in order to track down Harry and Dudley's grandfather. The place was a dump, and that was being generous. The 3 years' worth of dust that covered everything had actually improved the appearance of the cramped flat. By comparison, the rest of the occupied flats in the cake-shaped complex could be considered fit for a king. And Harry had checked their condition after he had cast a temporary X-ray spell on his glasses that would allow him to peer through walls, an ability inspired by the late Mad-Eye Moody's magical eye. The wizard sneezed as he inhaled another clump of dust and leveled a glare at the offensive apartment as if blaming the unlivable living space for its own inadequacy and deplorable condition. When he sneezed a second time just 5 seconds later, Harry was tempted to purchase the entire building and raze it to the ground just on general principle. He froze as he considered that idea, the purchasing part, not the raising, even if he still felt the building deserved it. After a moment, he nodded to himself. The building sat right on the edge of the nearby commercial zone, and with the help of his elves, he could easily get the entire complex and convert the building into a restaurant with plenty of living space above. There was even room enough for him to have a carriage house built on the ground level so as to offer transportation to and from the restaurant for the customers. Something that would help set the place apart from other restaurants and hopefully draw customers, and an idea that Dudley had mentioned a time or two in passing. Relocating the handful of other tenants that lived in the building might be a hassle, but so long as he gave them at least 30 days notice to vacate the premises, he shouldn't have a problem getting them out. He could even sweeten the deal for them by offering to pay their moving expenses and allowing them to stay rent-free for the full 30 days so as not to inconvenience them. All he had to do was make certain that Naruto would be alright with what he planned. This had been his cousin's first home for at least 3 years, after all. Glancing sideways at the 11-year-old in question, and sneezing yet again, Harry figured it wouldn't be too hard to get the kid to agree to the changes that Harry was envisioning based upon the embarrassed glare the blonde was giving the kitchen, from where he was standing in the middle of the room. Another sneeze settled the matter in Harry's mind, and he gathered his Gryffindor courage and Slytherin tact as he addressed the younger boy in English. "Oi, Squirt, just how attached are you to this dump? I hate it, but it's the only place I ever lived when I still lived here in Konoha, well aside from the orphanage. It's never been home though, not like Grimmauld Place or the house we shared in the Elemental District was." Naruto replied slowly as he glanced about the room while Harry sneezed for what seemed the millionth time. "Part of me wishes I could tear it down just so I don't ever have to see it again." "Yeah, I know that feeling, and I've only been in here for 20 minutes. Harry dryly agreed around a series of sneezes that had him whipping out the Elder Wand and vanishing every last particle of dust within range of his spell. "What do you say we buy the building, kick the other tenants out, gut it like a fish, and use it for the Namikaze restaurant? Nanny!" Naruto exclaimed as he whipped his head around to stare at Harry in shock, the preteen falling back into Japanese out of habit. "Well, think about it. This building sits right on the edge of the market district, which means that it is zoned for both commercial and residential use. The lot is also big enough to have the restaurant, a carriage house, and lots of living space above both of the businesses. Hell, there's even enough room up on the roof to build a greenhouse. And while you technically still be living in the same building, it would be nothing like this poor excuse for a flat. The building probably should have been condemned long before you moved in. Do you think the Hokage would allow it? I don't see why not. Even the displacement of the current tenants wouldn't cause that many problems since there are so few. Buying the entire building would also mean that we could all live together until you get sick of us, find yourself a cute little girlfriend to marry, and move into your parents' old home so we old folks don't get on your last nerve. There isn't enough room for all of the horses though, Naruto pointed out as he ignored the jib about getting a girlfriend and getting married. The boy still thought girls had cooties. So, we look for a large vacant lot we can buy and turn it into a proper pasture for the pony brigade and rotate the horses that haul the carriages on a weekly basis. Do you think Arita and Eri will agree to it? We could ask them when we see them for lunch. I know Dutters has been disappointed and in some cases disgusted with each of the available buildings that the real estate agent has shown him. Most of them are far too small for our needs and sit on lots that are far too small for us to use to our advantage. Dudley had taken one look at the property right after lunch and immediately grasped the potential that Harry had seen for the lot and the building. Eloise had been thrilled with the fact that there more than enough space for both the restaurant and their family, since it meant that there would be plenty of room for the little one they had on the way. Convincing the Hokage to sell the property to the small family had been fairly easy since the influx of ready cash would greatly boost Konoha's floundering economy when combined with the future jobs that opening their restaurant would provide. It also helped that all 5 current tenants were quite willing to take Harry's offer of a month free of rent and fully paid moving expenses, in the form of 5D ranked missions for 5 genin teams. That was on top of the week-long D-ranked mission that would be filed to have a genin team, or 2, help haul out the trash from the vacant apartments. The 4C ranked missions to hire some help to completely gut the building 1 floor at a time from the ground up. And the assortment of D and C ranked delivery missions that would be placed for any out-of-town supply purchases, for those items they hadn't brought with them, since the 3 Namikaze adults wouldn't be allowed out of the village for the remainder of their probation. While Dudley was handling the details of the new purchase and hiring contractors to help them renovate the building, Harry spent his free time cantering through the village looking for a potential lot to buy for the horses. The current lot where their wagons were parked was for sale, but it was just far too small, and because it sat right smack dab in the middle of the village, far too impractical to use for the horses on a long-term basis. There were more than enough lots and parks scattered through the village that would have made perfect pastures. The problem was that each one of those particular places were already designated as shinobi training grounds or actual parks and therefore not for sale, at any price. It wouldn't be until around the middle of the month that Harry stumbled across the ruins of 2 large estates that were situated near the wall in the northwestern part of the village and fairly close to one another. The northernmost estate sat at the southern edge of a group of streets that formed a diamond, was close enough to the river that fresh water wouldn't be an issue, not that it would have been anyway with his magic, and there were no village-owned training grounds or occupied homes within 10 miles of the estate. The second estate sat just a few miles south and slightly to the west of the first one, was on the very edge of the closest residential area, and ran almost right next to the 15-foot clear zone where Harry continued to exercise the horses at least twice a week. With both estates being on the edge of the village, it meant that the horses' presence wouldn't cause a problem with any neighbors. There was also more than enough room to pasture the 2 breeds of horses he'd brought with him separately, in addition to setting up a small farm to grow fresh produce for the restaurant and a small crop or 2 of alfalfa to help offset the cost of feeding the horses. And with the road surrounding the upper estate being unused, and therefore unmaintained by the village, and nothing but forest land separating the 2 estates, Harry could probably talk the Hokage to letting him extend the property lines of both properties to make one large estate. That would allow him to claim the neglected roads so he could clean them up to create a private training track or a riding track. All he had to do was figure out what angle he needed to use to get the stubborn old man to agree to let him purchase such a large tract of land in addition to the 2 estates. He then thought about the information that the Sandaime, Ibiki, and Yamato had been attempting to get out of him in regards to his Kekei Genkai, the Kyubi, and his past, and wondered if he could barter some of that information alongside of his vast fortune, the full extent of which he'd never disclosed. On November 20th, when the first of the tenants moved out of the old apartment complex, Harry finally approached the Hokage in regards to the 2 estates and the tract of land he wished to purchase. He had with him copies of the old public survey reports of the land in question, the 2 estates and the land that separated them, a description and photos of the current condition of both estates, an itemized list of the work he intended to do to the land and how he intended to use it once he finished cleaning up the properties, and a very specific list of what assets and which information he was willing to depart with in order to purchase said land. Dudley had helped him write everything up in proper legalese so that it looked and sounded professional. Harry ended up spending 5 hours sequestered with the Hokage negotiating for the purchase of the land he needed to keep, breed, and raise his horses as well as grow an assortment of produce for their restaurant. In the end, it cost him 5 million ryo, 1/2 paid up front, a quarter of which was paid in ready cash and the other quarter paid in precious metals and gemstones, and the other half covered by a 20-year mortgage loan purchased through the Bank of Konoha with a fixed interest rate of 10%. A demonstration of 3 skills/abilities he had not previously revealed, and 20 questions worth of personal information from him, 5 regarding the bijou he carried, 5 regarding his Kekkei Genkai, and 10 regarding his past. The only conditions he had given them regarding that information were, that he would not reveal the name of his Kekkei Genkai, that he would not answer any general or open-ended questions, meaning the questions had to be very specific, and that he would not answer any questions until he held the deeds to his new property in his hands. It would take the Hokage 6 days to procure the deeds to the Hattori and Shizen estates, and the tract of land that sat between both estates ran from the westernmost edges of the 2 estates to the edge of the forest that bordered the 15-foot buffer that hugged the village's wall, and extended no further than the northernmost point of the Shizen estate, which ended at the top of the diamond formed by 2 of the roads that bordered the estate, and no lower than the southernmost edge of the Hattori estate that ended at the start of a public road. The purchase included the rights to all of the forest contained within the new boundaries of what would become the new Namikaze estate and the roads that ran around the Shizen estate, providing he followed the village's laws regarding all forestry within the village. That was also the earliest day his war council, Jiraiya, Tsunade, Ibiki, Shikaku, and the current Umbu commander, code-named Kasai, his advisory council, Yuditane Koharu and Mitokado Hamura, Yamato, as Harry's mentor and minder, and Kakashi, because he interacted with the family regularly, were all available to meet. Harry walked into the Hokage's office on the heels of Yamato and Kakashi and nearly tripped over his feet when he saw just how many people were standing around in the office, and he would have scowled if hadn't already suspected that the Hokage would have a number of his best shinobi present at this meeting in order to get the most out of the small interrogation he'd agreed to take part in. He closed his eyes briefly and sent up a prayer for patience and strength before he wiped his face clear of all emotions and positioned himself in the center of the room where he could see everyone clearly. Konbanwa, Hokage-sama and company, Harry greeted with a respectful bow before he nodded to the others present. Good evening, Takashi-san, the Hokage replied in return with a small nod of acknowledgement as he activated the privacy barrier to prevent anyone from eavesdropping on their meeting. I have the deeds to your new property here along with an official copy of the property assessment and property line survey that was taken within the last 24 hours. The original assessment and survey have been filed with the records office along with official copies of the deeds to the 3 properties. Please take a moment to make certain everything is in order before we discuss the agreed-upon information payment that was part of the deal. Arigato, Hokage-sama, Harry murmured as he stepped forward to collect scroll containing the official documents that the Sandaime held out for him to take. He took a brief moment to confirm that everything was in order. It was, before he tucked the documents back into the scroll and slipped the scroll into one of the hidden inner pockets of his cloak. Where did you wish me to start, Hokage-sama? With a demonstration of 3 skills that you have previously not disclosed, providing that they are not destructive in nature, as I prefer that you didn't destroy my office, the Sandaime replied as he removed his hat and sat back to study Harry. Wakarimasu, Harry replied as he drew his holly wand and considered what he could show them that wouldn't create a mess. After a moment he decided on the stunning spell, the disarming spell, and the conjuration spell. The first skill is an ability to knock a person unconscious without touching them. Harry flicked his wand at Kakashi and fired a silent stunning spell that caught the Jounin completely off guard as the red light washed over the man. There are only 2 ways to recover from this method of attack. I can wake him up with the counter, or I can leave him to wake up on his own in 5 to 10 hours from now. The length of time a victim is out depends upon the amount of power I use in conjunction with the victim's age, body mass, and current physical, mental, and emotional health. Please wake him up now, the Sandaime requested after Tsunade had confirmed that the man was just unconscious and that she couldn't wake him with a jutsu. Harry flicked his wand at the unconscious Jounin a second time and the man woke up with a slight headache and a dry mouth. He gave Harry a dirty look the moment he realized that he'd just been used as the wizard's guinea pig. The young mage just smirked at the silver-haired man while Tsunade scanned him a second time. Harry would wait another minute before he continued with his demonstration. The second ability is closely related to the ability to knock an individual unconscious, and it is the ability to completely disarm an opponent without needing to physically touch them or even know where they have hidden all of their weapons on their person. Harry continued as he flicked his wand at Ibiki and cast a silent disarming spell at him, followed by a silent summoning charm that piled the man's many weapons at Harry's feet. I can also return the weapons in a similar manner. A banishing charm shoved the pile of sharp and pointy objects back over to the now glowering interrogator. And the final ability, Shikaku asked lazily as he turned to watch Hibiki irritably gather up the confiscated weapons and return them to their proper places, is a little bit harder to define since it involves the ability to conjure any non-living object, Harry replied as he tucked his holly wand away, pulled out the Elder Wand, and swept his arm wide as he conjured enough chairs for everyone that was currently standing. I suppose you could say that I am my own personal supply warehouse, though the ability does have limits. The things I create are not permanent, I cannot create edible food, and I cannot create actual life even if I can animate any object that I conjure. Harry demonstrated this by animating one of the chairs and having it gallop around the room before he cancelled the animation charm after its second circuit. The wizard then tucked the wand away and turned his attention back to the Hokage as he asked, I trust my demonstration was satisfactory, Hokage-sama. Hi, though it did bring to mind at least another dozen questions I'd love to ask you about your abilities and makes me wonder what else you are hiding from us. Harry said nothing as he smiled at the man to whom he'd sworn his oath of loyalty and waited for the Inquisition to begin as he mentally prepared himself for the questions he knew they would ask. Questions to which they'd been seeking the answers to since the day they'd first arrived in Konoha close to 2 months earlier. In order to make things easier for everyone to follow and for you to keep track of the questions you are asked, I've asked Shikaku to be our spokesman, the Sandaime finally stated after he'd watched Jiraiya tentatively seat himself in one of the conjured chairs that were still scattered about the room. Wakarimasu, Harry murmured before he turned to give his complete attention to the misleadingly lazy man. You have, on more than one occasion, made references to war in which you fought, Shikaku stated in a measured tone as he crossed his arms over his chest and studied Harry from beneath hooded eyes. What was the rationale behind the war? Has the war actually ended or has it just been shelved for the time being? And on which side of the conflict did you fight, the winning side or the losing side? 1. The war was fought over blood heritage. To put it in terms that you can relate to, a group of Kekii Genkai holders that believed they were superior because they had an unbroken line of Kekii Genkai users in their family tree for at least 3 generations, the longer that line remained unbroken, the more esteemed their family was considered, sought to eradicate all of those who they saw as inferior, basically. Anyone who did not have a Kekii Genkai, anyone who was a first-generation Kekii Genkai user or the only Kekii Genkai holder in their family, and anyone who didn't agree with their beliefs. 2. I do not know if the war is over for good or not. The prejudices in the society into which I was born run rampant and similar wars have visited our world many times, over the past 1100 years, and there always seem to be enough discontent individuals to pick up the torch every 20 to 30 years. The most recent continuation of the war actually started in the mid to late 1960s, experienced a brief period of peace from October 31, 1981 until June of 95. And picked up steam in June of 96 before I defeated the leader of the Blood Purists in May of 1998. Right now, the number of Blood Purists that remain are currently at an all-time low due to a number of families dying out or ending up in prison. Additionally, there are a number of influential individuals that are working to change the laws and traditions that propagated the seeds of discontent. However, it is still far too soon to tell whether or not they will be successful in bridging the gap between the purebloods, those from families with 3 or more unbroken generations of Kekii Genkai users, and the newborns, those who are the first Kekii Genkai user within their families. 3. I was on the winning side, the side that fought for equality amongst all and to protect the innocents from the deprivations of those who sought to crush those they considered beneath them. Shikaku's eyes sharpened as he stood up just a little straighter before he asked, You said that you defeated the leader of the opposition. Was your personal victory just happenstance or was that your goal? What exactly was the part you played in the war? How many of your enemies still live? And what are the chances that your enemies will seek out you or your family here in Konoha? 4. Defeating the leader of the opposition was my end goal. I faced him personally no less than 6 times over the course of my first 17 years and fought his followers on more than one occasion. 5. Is a bit more complicated to explain or define. My parents and I were semi-responsible for the 14 years of peace that disrupted the most recent 2 halves of the ongoing war, or more specifically, my parents' deaths and my inexplicable survival was the catalyst for the 14 years of peace. I was also both the rallying point and the de facto leader for the second half of the most recent war after the previous leader was killed. I was also meant to die a martyr's death. 6. I don't have an exact number, but I would estimate between 20 and 30 of Tom's followers still live. And 7. The chances are actually fairly non-existent for several reasons. A. Knowledge of the elemental nations is almost non-existent in the outer countries. B. Less than 5 people living in the outer countries know I traveled through the portal with my family. C. With the exception of Naruto, all of us changed our names completely so as not to stand out on this side of the portal. None of us were born Namikazes, even if Erita and I have Namikaze blood running through our veins. And D. The number of people that live on the other side of the portal that are capable of opening the portal number less than a dozen according to what I was told. Who raised you after your parents died? Shikaku asked after a long period of silence in which Harry suspected the more experienced shinobi in the office used coded hand signs to discuss his answers and the remaining 3 questions about his past that they wanted answered the most. 8. My maternal aunt and her husband, Harry answered, the wizard numbering the answer out of habit in order to keep track of the number of questions he'd been asked. Were your aunt and uncle the ones that abused you during your childhood? Harry scowled and tensed his shoulders as he closed his eyes and fought the urge to tell the older man where to shove the highly invasive question. Once he was in control of his emotions, Harry answered in a clipped tone, I was not abused. I was unwanted, unloved, and unhappy on top of being moderately neglected, but they did not outright abuse me. Despite the many, many parallels between mine and Naruto's early life, I had a constant roof over my head, clothes on my back, and food in my stomach so long as I didn't cause trouble. Last question regarding your past, why did you willingly choose to travel to Konoha in the company of your older cousin when your cousin freely admitted to the fact that he had bullied you during most of your shared childhood? When Tom, the much-feared leader of the opposition, made his big return, those in charge of the government did not wish to believe the man still lived, and so they sought to shut me up because I was the only one that had witnessed the man's return aside from a small number of his followers. They sent a type of low-level demon to kill me. My cousin and I were both caught up in the attack and I used my Kekii Genkai to save our lives, a Kekii Genkai that my aunt, uncle, and cousin do not possess. Those demons have the ability to force a person to view their darkest memories, and the attack shook my cousin up and woke him up. The person my cousin is now is a far different person than he was before that attack. He turned his life around and I had no right to hold the way he was raised against him when he was just as much a victim of my upbringing as I was. Only he ended up on the other side of the coin. We both matured during the final 2 years of the war as we were forced to grow up. And in case you're wondering, no, I don't hate my cousin for what happened in the past because to hate him now would be to belittle his accomplishments. Harry finished with a crooked half-smile that was part wistful, part bemused, and part wry. After all, in the end, family is family and I never turn my back on family. Not even if they hate me. Otherwise I would have left my aunt and uncle to the likes of Tom and his little lapdogs and thanked him for saving me the trouble of disposing of them myself. A small break was taken at that point as the Hokage asked his secretary to bring them a pot of tea and a light snack. The discussion about his past had taken close to an hour and a half because some of his replies had been rather long-winded. While he waited, Harry meditated in order to soothe his inner torment and lay the memories of the war and his childhood back to rest so that he would be clear-headed for the second half of the interrogation. Tsunade actually stepped up behind him and soothed the mild headache he'd developed due to the stressful and unpleasant subject, and Harry would have happily taken a nap when she finished if not for the arrival of the requested refreshments. The next topic we wish to cover is the bijou you are carrying. Shikaku stated once everyone had had a chance to drink at least a single cup of tea and eat some of the anpan that had been provided with the beverage. Through the process of elimination based upon the public knowledge of the Jinchuriki and their burdens, we've determined that the bijou that you are carrying has between 4 and 7 tails. So, the first question we have is, which of the bijou are you carrying? The Kyubi. Chapter 21, Information Overload. Monday, November 26, 2001, evening. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni. The moment Harry had announced which bijou he contained, pandemonium filled the office for several minutes as the shinobi protested his claim or spluttered in shock. It was actually kind of amusing to witness because shinobi were usually so unflappable and Harry's inner prankster just loved spreading chaos. That is not possible, Jiraiya blurted out the moment the furor settled down enough for the man to make himself heard, the Gamma Sennin frowning intently at Harry. Naruto-kun carries the 9-tailed fox. How could you possibly be carrying the Kyubi if Naruto is still obviously carrying the Kyubi? Shikaku inquired on the heels of Jiraiya's protest while everyone else fell silent in order to hear Harry's response. We have solid proof that his seal has not been tampered with at any point in his life. In order for me to answer that, I have to ask, how much do you know about what happened the night Minato sealed the Kyuubi into Naruto? Harry asked instead of immediately answering the question as he buried his amusement over their temporary loss of control. We know that he summoned the Shinigami in order to exchange his soul for the power and strength to seal the Kyuubi within his son, the Hokage answered with a puzzled frown. There was no one present aside from those involved in the sealing, so we don't know exactly what transpired. We only have hints that we used to deduce what we could of the situation, such as the fact that both Kushina and Minato had been fatally wounded at some point before the Kyuubi had been resealed. Okay, that at least gives an idea of just how little you know about what happened. Rather than go into a detailed explanation, I'm going to summarize the relevant information into a chronological list of facts as I know them to help you understand. If you want the detailed information, you're going to have to ask Minato because he can explain it better. And, because your question was rather broad, my answer is also going to be worth a full 3 questions due to how much information I'll be giving you, Harry stated as he focused his gaze on the floor to better concentrate on his answer. Fact 1. Kushina was dying because the Kyuubi had been forcefully extracted from her by an enemy. Fact 2. Minato and Kushina argued about sealing the Kyuubi into Naruto before they came to an agreement. Fact 3. Only a newborn or another Uzumaki with Kushina's abilities could have survived the resealing. Fact 4. The entirety of the Kyuubi's soul and chakra were far too powerful to seal inside of a newborn child, hence why Uzumaki Kushina was selected as Mito's successor, instead of a newborn baby. Fact 5. The Shinigami ripped away the Kyuubi's Yin chakra and half of its soul through Minato and the Kyuubi's Yang chakra and the other half of its soul through Naruto, with Kushina's help, which is how half of the Kyuubi ended up sealed inside of Naruto. Fact 6. The Kyuubi's Yin chakra and partial soul that the Shinigami ripped from the Kyuubi were devoured alongside of Minato's soul when the Shinigami's task was completed. Fact 7. In my ignorance and in pursuit of the knowledge I needed to know in order to understand why Naruto claimed he was a demon, I mistakenly summoned the Shinigami that had devoured Minato's spirit when I attempted to call upon my cousin's soul. Fact 8. I challenged the Shinigami without fully understanding what the being was capable of, and the end result was that the Shinigami freed Minato's soul and shoved the second half of the Kyuubi's chakra and soul into me, forcefully expanding my chakra coils at the same time. And let me tell you, that hurt like a bitch too. Fact 9. Both halves of the Kyuubi's soul can now be considered separate entities due to the fact that the half within me experienced a form of death while the half inside of Naruto did not. And fact 10. Without my Kekii Genkai, I would have died instantly. Harry finally looked up at the gathered individuals as he added, you get one more question about the Kyuubi. I suppose that's only fair, Shikaku murmured with a slight pout that almost made Harry burst out laughing. There's something I don't understand, how is it possible to split a Bijuu's soul? And how do you know you have exactly half? Does that mean that the light half of the Kyuubi's soul rests in Naruto while the dark half resides in you? That's 3 questions. Not one, Nara-san, Harry dryly pointed out, which drew a slight blush from the older man and amused chuckles from the rest of the room. I suppose I can let it slide though, since you at least kept them to the same topic and it's not as if I know the full answer to the first question you asked. The wizard trailed off for a moment as he considered the question. I suppose you could say that the reason it was possible for the Kyuubi's soul to be split was the same way it was possible for the Rikudo Sennin to split the Jubi's soul into the 9-tailed beasts. As for the other questions, props. I need props. Harry muttered as he patted down his cloak until he located the pocket where he kept his blank scrolls and drew one out, even as he drew out the Elder Wand once more with his other hand. He then transfigured the scroll into a 3-foot-tall replica of the Kyuubi that he placed on a small waist-high table he conjured as an afterthought to make the demonstration easier for everyone to see. Okay, the 9 Bijuu were formed when the Rikudo Sennin sundered the Jubi, and while they are sentient and have souls, they are usually considered constructs of potent chakra rather than beings of flesh and blood, correct? Yes, Tsunade answered while everyone else was studying the amazingly lifelike miniature kitsune sitting on the stool in front of the wizard. A soul is somewhat intangible, but it requires a physical form in order to remain on this plane of existence. In a living being, that is their body. For a ghost, they are usually tied to a place or an object. A person's chakra is made up of both physical energy and spiritual, or mental, energy, and both types of energy are tied to both the soul and the body, and that is what holds the soul in the living body. For ghosts, their mental energy has latched onto the physical energy of the place or object that they are tied to. The two types of energy mix freely within the body and the soul, and it is that mingling that forms a person's life force, or what you call chakra. Chakra can be further broken down into yin and yang, which are both made up of a mixture of both energies and which represent light and dark, but light and dark does not equate good and evil. The best way to describe them two types of chakra would be positive and negative. Both have their uses, but neither is good nor is either evil. A person feels both positive and negative emotions throughout their lifetime, after all. And getting angry does not mean that you are evil, and being happy doesn't necessarily mean you are a good person. With both types of energy and both types of chakra freely mingling inside of a person, the splitting of a soul is not as simple as cutting it in half down the middle. Harry continued as he used the Elder Wand to create a non-burning dark red flame to represent the Kyubi-Zen chakra and a pale yellow flame to form the Yang chakra, with both types of flames possessing blue and green tongues of flame representing the mental and physical energies, and allowed them to mingle before he cut the model in half. As you can see, if you just split the soul right down the middle, you'll get an uneven mixture of both types of chakra and both types of energy on top of two unstable soul pieces, but will have exactly one half of the Kyubi's energy. Instead, the Shinigami grabbed hold of the Kyubi-Zen chakra using Minato's soul as a conduit and the Kyubi's Yang chakra using Naruto's soul as a conduit, and pulled the two chakra types apart while Kushina physically restrained the Kyubi to prevent it from escaping, Harry explained as he repaired the model. He then added little ghostly replicas of Minato, Kushina, Naruto, and the Shinigami and set them up so the Shinigami had grabbed hold of the dark flames with one hand through Minato and the light flames with the other through Naruto, and pulled while Kushina chained the model in place with chakra chains. As the model was torn asunder once more, the Kyubi's soul was pulled from the body and split into two identical copies of the Kyubi, one wrapped all in dark flames and other all wrapped in pale flames, while the Kyubi's body turned to dust. As you can see, forcefully separating the Yin chakra from the Yang chakra split the Kyubi's soul into two seemingly identical halves, while the body was destroyed by the backlash of power required to sunder the soul. The difference between the soul fragment that I carry and the soul fragment that Naruto carries is that Naruto received the Kyubi's consciousness and Yang chakra, while I hold the Kyubi's subconsciousness and Yin chakra. Both halves are equal even if they are not the same, and both halves can now be considered independent of one another since they can function alone even if they were both formerly part of the whole. Both halves have the full range of emotions, despite the separation of Yin and Yang, and both halves have exactly half of the Kyubi's chakra, so they are equal in power. The difference between them would be that Naruto's half of the soul will have the drive to actively try to corrupt him, while the half I carry will potentially try far more insidious methods in order to get to me once the beast awakens. However, because I am far older, more mature, and have fewer insecurities than Naruto, the Kyubi will have a harder time influencing me. At the same time, I am far more jaded than Naruto and less willing to see the good in everyone. Harry banished his little aides at that point and returned the former Kyubi model back into its original form of a blank scroll and tucked it back into his pocket while he waited for the others to assimilate the sheer volume of information that Harry had just given to them. For a brief moment, Harry was afraid that he'd broken the older adults in the office with his explanation on how it was possible to separate a soul into two pieces and how the souls had been split to create two new equal entities due to the silence that had fallen over the office, in direct contrast to the earlier pandemonium over the revelation that he held half of the Kyubi. Shikaku looked particularly constipated, and Harry imagined the man's brain must be working overtime as he could practically see the smoke rising from the man's ears. Kakashi appeared to be bored and reading his ever-present orange book, but Harry knew the Jounin hadn't so much as turned a single page since he pulled the book from his utility pouch. Jiraiya was muttering to himself as he scratched the back of his left leg with the top of his right foot, and Tsunade was fiddling with her necklace pendant as she stared out over the village, seemingly lost in thought. The masked Kasai was difficult to read behind his mask, but he was obviously observing Harry through the eyes of his stylized flame mask. Ibiki was practically drilling holes through Harry as the man undoubtedly analyzed everything he'd learned so far and used that information to further psychoanalyze Harry's mental and emotional state. Sarutobi's two former teammates were as lost in thought as Tsunade, though they were both focused entirely on Harry and had near calculating gleams in their eyes. And Yamato. Yamato was currently inspecting one of the wooden chairs that Harry had conjured earlier, and Harry got the distinct impression that the man was trying commune with Harry's conjured chair like he does with the trees and plants scattered about the village. As he watched his mentor and minder, Harry saw the man grow another chair that was identical in every way to the one that Harry had grown, with the exception that Harry's had been made with pure magic while Yamato's chair had been made with pure chakra. Harry was forced to smother a snicker when the man actually leaned down and started sniffing the two chairs as if he sought to determine whether or not they both smelled the same. Mendekusei, you have no idea how many questions I have clamoring about in my head right now, Shikaku complained eventually, drawing everyone's attention from the private little worlds they had slipped into in their efforts to process the information Harry had given them. I've half a mind to accuse you of intentionally offering to answer a handful of questions just so you can generate thousands more and confuse us so thoroughly that we forget what we were originally looking to learn. Has it worked, Nara-san? Harry asked cheekily as he ducked his head and ran his index finger over the tip of his nose so that he was watching the man from over the top of his glasses. Are you certain that you aren't related to Kushina instead of Minato? She was the consummate prankster with the hair-trigger temper, Jiraiya complained as he made a face at Harry. Positive, though, I am the son, godson, and honorary nephew of 3 of the greatest pranksters to ever grace the halls of my boarding school. I also still own a joke shop and am the silent financial backer/partner of a second joke shop in the outer countries. The money I earn from those 2 investments will pay for the upkeep of the properties that I couldn't bring myself to sell because of the heritage they represent. Just how rich are you, anyway? Tsunade inquired with affected casualness. Irrelevant. I only brought enough money and tradable commodities with me to ensure that our family could survive for up to a minimum of 5 years while we established ourselves here in Konoha, something that we knew would take time. In other words, the man is filthy stinking rich and he's not going to share any of that wealth with you so that you can finance your gambling habit and alcohol addiction. Shikaku snarkily translated, something that had Harry choking on air as he whipped around to stare at the man. How else do you explain the fact that you bought an entire apartment complex with ready cash and paid half up front when you purchased 2 abandoned estates and a large tract of prime forest land, with more than enough cash on hand to pay the full price, Takashi-san? Bloody hell, you're like a female version of Hermione, Harry complained in English as he hunched his shoulders and pouted at the man. He at least had the satisfaction of knowing that he'd just confused the man entirely in return by using a language that he was obviously not familiar with. Aren't you a little old to be pouting? Ibiki inquired with a drawl that made it sound like he was laughing at Harry. Aren't you a little too old to stoop so low as to pick on the rookie in the room? Harry fired right back without missing a beat. The tension in the office eased as everyone laughed at the short exchange before making themselves comfortable once more as they waited for Shikaku to wrap up the short interrogation. The man in question sighed as he dropped back against the wall once more and readopted a lazy pose before he complained, I suppose we might as well wrap things up here before my troublesome wife yells at me for staying out late and accuses me of drinking with Chusa and Inoichi instead of attending a meeting with Sarutobi-sama. The last topic we have to cover is your Kekkai Genkai, and since we know so little about your ability aside from what you've told us and what you've shown us, and you've requested that we not ask you what your ability is called, why don't you give us 10 words that apply to your Kekkai Genkai that we can use to determine which missions your skills will be of the most use on? 10 words, huh? I think I can do that, Harry murmured as he dropped his head back to stare up the ceiling for a moment while he scratched his chin. When he began speaking again, each word was weighed and measured before he spoke it out loud. Versatility, unpredictability, sentience, no, intuitiveness maybe, willpower, raw power, responsibility, belief, or maybe confidence would be the better word, balance, healing and health, they're close to being the same thing but not quite, and death. At what age did you activate your ability, when did you start training your ability, and how many years of training has it taken you to master your abilities? In order, the day I was born, shortly after my 11th birthday, and I never stopped learning or training my ability as it takes an entire lifetime to master it. I suppose that brings us to the last question, does your son and Naruto also have the same Kekkai Genkai? Naruto. No, my Kekkai Genkai was passed down through my maternal grandmother and not mine and Naruto's common ancestor. My son, on the other hand, does have the same Kekkai Genkai, though that doesn't mean that we will both be able to use it the same way, and there are specific skills that we each have that can't be taught to another because they are inherited. such as my son's ability to change his appearance without the need to use a henge and my ability to speak to snakes. I don't suppose there's anything else you'd be willing to share?" Kasai asked with a mixture of resignation and hope. I suppose that I could tell you that out of those individuals born with my Kekii Genkai, I am the strongest of my generation within the land of my birth and potentially worldwide, though I've not met enough people from around the world to know for certain, and that assumption was based upon a test that was taken 5 or 6 years ago. I might be willing to admit that I haven't even scratched the surface of what my Kekii Genkai can do and could potentially do in the future with the proper training. It might be prudent of me to admit that my Kekii Genkai is in no way connected to my chakra and therefore allows me to continue fighting even after I've exhausted my chakra reserves. My secondary reserves are currently between 6 and 9 times larger than my current chakra reserves and will continue to grow until I reach my 25th birthday, which means that I could continue to function for days while suffering chakra exhaustion. Conversely, if my secondary reserves are exhausted, then I'll be completely useless no matter how much chakra I have available. And lastly, I should warn you, if I hear perfect strangers or worse civilians discussing my abilities on the street, I will remove all knowledge of me, my abilities, and my family from the minds of everyone on this side of the portal using a seal that is more complex than the one that holds the Kyuubi at bay. I grudgingly provided a wealth of information today because I realize that I have to be willing to trust you up to a point. If you are to trust me in return, and because I am aware of the tactical advantage it would be for you to have an idea of what I am capable of doing. It helps that aside from the occasional idiot or bigot, most of the villagers show none of the open hostility that Naruto had told me about when I first met him. I also like living here far more than I thought I would, and I find it relaxing to walk or ride down the street and not worry about being mobbed by rabid fangirls or fanboys. Blessed Anonymity agrees with me just as much as I'd hoped it would. You have my word that no one outside of this room will learn anything about your abilities that they don't already know or what they have seen you do with their own eyes, the Hokage solemnly intoned as he filled the bowl of his pipe with tobacco, tamped the tobacco down, and lit the pipe with a long match that he struck on the graphite strip glued to the outside of his ashtray. I certainly have no desire to jeopardize the working relationship that we've developed over the past 2 months. The only noteworthy point of contention would be the feud that you started with Tokubetsu Mitarashi. I started nothing. She was the one that had been glaring at the boys simply because they'd tagged along with me to buy some dango the moment they heard where Yamato-san was taking me. If that wasn't irritating enough, the damn woman had the gall to attack me in front of my son while my back was turned. She terrified my son, and because he still can't control his Kekii Genkai when he is emotional, my son's ability was on full display for every single person in that damn stand. Something I most certainly did not want to happen. That she also pulled that stunt in front of Naruto was sheer stupidity on her part. Naruto is highly protective of Satoshi, whom he sees as a little brother, and he is more than a little vindictive when it comes to pranking those that he feels harmed or slighted his precious people in any way. Are you trying to tell me that an 11-year-old is the one pranking Anko 2 and 3 times per day? Ibiki demanded in disbelief. Yes, he is. His skills in pranking and trapping have grown by leaps and bounds since I first met him, Harry replied with a cheeky grin that was a little on the feral side. Besides, is a genin pranking a Tokubetsu Jounin without getting caught really any different than a half-trained chunin pranking one of the Sannin and getting away with it? What are you talking about? Jiraiya asked curiously at the same time as Tsunade demanded, you did that? Did you really think that I was going to just let your merciless teasing go unpunished, Tsunade-sama? What did you do? Kasai inquired as the volatile Kunoichi glared murderously at the younger shinobi. The little gaki made my hair fall out, and it took me almost 3 weeks to grow it out again. Tsunade hissed as she drew back her fist to punch Harry, the wizard saved from the brutal beating by Jiraiya grabbing hold of his teammate's fist. At least I didn't prevent you from covering the loss with a glamour, which I could have done. Jiraiya, let me go so that I can give the gaki the beating he deserves. You can try, but that doesn't mean I'll just let you hit me. I may be reckless, but I'm not stupid enough to just stand still and let you punch me when I'm fully aware of just how much damage you could do to me with your chakra. Enhanced strength, Harry stated as he took 2 steps away from the angry woman and palmed the Elder Wand once more. I respect your abilities as both a medic and a kunoichi, but that doesn't mean that I'll just sit and take anything you dish out, including embarrassing the hell out of me just because I chose not to sleep with any of the girls and women that threw themselves at me from the moment I hit puberty. Wait, did you just imply that you're still a virgin? Jiraiya demanded in shock as he let go of Tsunade to twist around to stare at Harry in utter disbelief. The fact that Harry turned bright red and refused to meet the man's gaze appeared to be answer enough. "Oh, you poor boy, we can't let that stand. You'll come with me tonight and so we can cure you of that terrible injustice." Tsunade's fist sent Jiraiya flying into the nearest wall as her ire immediately switched targets. Harry blinked at the spot where Jiraiya had been standing before his eyes slipped sideways to take in the now unconscious Sandaime pooled in an undignified puddle at the base of the wall. He then turned to eye the still irritated woman that hadn't hesitated to pound her teammate. "Tsunade-sama, perhaps I owe you an apology for seeing your teasing as annoying when it has just become obvious that there are some things that are far more horrifying than a little friendly teasing. I'll let you make it up to me by allowing you to take me out for dinner and sake tonight. I'd be happy to treat you to a meal at a restaurant of your choice, however. Tonight is not a good night as I promised Arata that I'd help him work on the blueprints for the restaurant once I was finished here," Harry replied with a slight frown. "In fact, he's probably wondering where I am since this meeting has taken a bit longer than I anticipated. Was there anything else you needed from me or may I go now?" "I believe that we are finished with you for the time being," the Sandaime allowed after a brief and silent exchange with a couple of the higher-ranked shinobi in the office. "Thank you for sharing as much as you did. I believe we've learned far more than we expected to when we first negotiated tonight's meeting." Harry nodded absently before he spun on his heel and vanished from the office without a sound as he chose to apparate himself back to the wagons in order to save himself. The walk Naruto and Teddy were both waiting for him when he arrived and Harry soon found himself hauling both boys towards the Vardo where Dudley and Eloise were waiting for him. As they ate a small elf-made feast and pored over the blueprints for the ground floor of the old apartment complex they'd purchased, Harry filled the others in on how much information he ended up sharing with those that had been present at his meeting. A similar discussion was being held within the office he'd just left, though the Hokage and his shinobi were breaking down and analyzing the wealth of information that they had been given. It was a conversation that would last well beyond midnight as they also included all of the previous information they'd learned from the wizard and his family or through the observations of the Umbu guards that had been watching over the family. Tuesday, November 27, 2001 Monday, December 31, 2001. Konoha Gakure no Sato, Hai no Kuni. With the deeds to their new property in hand, Harry moved the wagons and their horses into a large clearing that sat between the former Shurzen and Hattori estates first thing in the morning of the 27th. He then created an army of Kage Bunshin that he set to clearing out the ruins of the Shurzen estate while he and a dozen more clones walked the property line and warded the entirety of the new Namikaze estate. He kept the wards fairly simple at this point, setting up a proximity ward to alert him to intruders and laying down a hostile intent ward that would prevent anyone that meant harm to anything or anyone inside of the ward harm from entering the property. Once the wards were up and running, Harry sent one clone to open a mission request for 3 genin teams to haul away the garbage that his clones were busy separating out from the reusable materials. Sure, he could do it himself using his clones, but he had been asked to share a portion of the work to convert the land he'd purchased into a functioning farm/horse ranch out amongst the village shinobi forces in order to help bolster the economy. Another clone was sent to the local mason to place a large order for the bricks, mortar mix, and concrete mix that would be needed to build the walls that Harry had planned. The steel rods he needed for the support framework of the walls would be purchased from the outer countries and secretly transported during the dead of night via house elf. The other 10 clones that had helped him raise the wards were then sent into the forest on the former Shurzen estate to mark those trees that needed to be relocated or cut down and mark suitable locations for the trees that were to be moved to. All residents required by law to maintain a specific number of trees per acre within the village. After his clones were properly occupied, Harry headed off to complete his usual daily routine, which included spending half of the morning training with Yamato, the other half of the morning at the academy learning Konoha's recent history and laws, basically anything that had happened after the Yandaime's death, and the afternoon either completing a mission or being dragged about on tours of the village so that he could learn the layout of the village and be introduced to other shinobi. Every Friday afternoon would find Harry in Tsunade's office for his scheduled treatments, while the mornings on the last Friday of each month were dedicated to his therapy sessions with Ibiki. The next 6 days would see Harry visiting the former Shurzen estate each morning before training in order to set an army of clones to work. On the 3rd of December, the same day when the last of the tenants had finally moved out of the apartment complex, the last of the debris had been cleared from the ruins and Harry had requested and promptly received permission to take a couple of days off to do some landscaping. He was rather surprised when Yamato turned up at the estate on the 4th to teach him a couple of Doton Jutsu that were often used to repair damaged training grounds. The Mokuton user even went so far as to help Harry level off the land centered within the roads around the former Shirzan estate, move or remove the trees Harry's clones had marked, and grow the fence to mark off a training arena for the horses. Harry suspected that the offer of help was both to allow the man to keep an eye on Harry and for him to monitor the work being done on the new estate, but he didn't mind. The reason for that was because with Yamato's help, he had done 3 days' worth of work over the course of a single day. December 5th would see Harry's clones begin building a brick and concrete wall to enclose the land inside of the road loop that bordered that section of land. The 10-foot wall would run right up against the inner edge of the road, have cement posts every 20 feet, to hold and hide the ward stones, be reinforced with magically enhanced steel running through the interlocking bricks that made up the sections between the posts, and be a full 1.5 feet thick. The interlocking pattern of bricks, which was not unidirectional like most wall patterns, and steel framework inside made for a stronger wall that would be much harder to break through than a normal brick or block wall, especially with magic enhancing and strengthening the structure. The same day also saw a genin team turning up at the apartment complex to help Dudley gut the ground floor of the apartment complex. It would take 2 days to gut each floor with a different team turning up each day to take the mission assignment. A total of 12 teams would end up working on the ongoing mission. At the same time, another team was hired to transport the bricks, mortar mix, and bags of concrete out to the Namikaze estate every 3 days as each shipment became ready. Harry's order far too large to fill in a single day, and the main reason he'd placed the order long before he started building the wall. During that time, Eloise would watch over Teddy and handle his lessons. She also planned out the layout and interior design for the restaurant now that the 3 adults had made a final decision on which type of restaurant they would be opening, which was based upon what they had learned of their current competition. Harry's elves were not idle during this time either. Each night, the magical beings would transport goods back and forth from Harry's house in the elemental district to the new estate, seed the newly formed pasture land with an appropriate mix of wild and domestic grasses that would provide a healthy and balanced diet for the horses, weed out any potentially harmful plants from the pastures, and use their magic to strengthen the growing wall, all without being seen by passing shinobi. The elves also helped with the renovation of the apartment complex, using their magic to reinforce the structure so that the building didn't collapse on their heads as they ripped out the non-load-bearing walls, eradicate any and all pests that had been living in the building, and clean up the dust and debris that was missed by the young shinobi that hauled away the trash. Once the entire apartment complex had been completely gutted on the 14th, Dudley hired an electrician to rewire the entire building, a plumber to do the same for the plumbing, and a contractor to convert the 2 bottom floors of the former complex into a restaurant and attached stable/carriage house. Harry didn't have the time to be there every day, but he did at least make it a point to have a few clones around to help Dudley deal with everything, something that his cousin appreciated. Each night, after the hired workers went home, Harry's clones would swarm the construction site and carve the runes for the protective wards that would shield the wiring from magic, reinforce the new plumbing, keep out pests, protect the restaurant from natural disasters, such as foul weather, and keep the smell of the horses that would be stabled in the carriage house from seeping into the restaurant. On the 10th, Harry found his daily routine changing a bit as his afternoon meet and greet tours were dropped in favor of focusing on his training. That mainly involved being taught a handful of jutsu. After Yamato tested his chakra affinities, he had a strong connection to both wind and water, undergoing stealth training, which Harry aced fairly quickly, improving his tracking skills, and joint training sessions with the endless number of shinobi that he'd been introduced to over the past several weeks. During the second half of the month, Harry would take a handful of breaks from his new training schedule to oversee the raising of several buildings on and around the former Shirzan property. Those would include 2 stables, a barn, to store hay, straw bedding, and riding tack, a garage, to house the wagons and harnesses, several granaries, a mill, and 3 water towers just to name a few. Once all of the outbuildings for the new Namikaze ranch had been built, he would turn his attention to the Hattori ruins in order to restart the process to create the Namikaze farm. Due to the high number of clones Harry had running around taking care of things, his intensive daily training sessions and mission schedule, and the large amounts of magic Harry was throwing about, Harry would fall into bed each night exhausted. He was practically running himself into the ground each day in his efforts to take care of everything that he personally needed to take care of, and it left him very little time to spend with his family. Dudley and Eloise were just as busy, though Eloise's days were more of a mental workout for her as she had to think of the baby she was carrying. And while Naruto had training and missions to keep him occupied, he was still nowhere near as busy as any of the adults. Poor Teddy ended up with the short end of the stick. Naruto spent time with the 3-year-old when he could, but it was nowhere near as much time as he spent with the younger boy before he'd become a shinobi. Harry hardly ever saw either of the boys, and the clones he had running around just weren't the same as spending time with the wizard. All Harry could do was promise to spend more time with both of them once the restaurant, their new apartments, and the estate were finished. Naruto accepted and understood the situation, but Teddy was extremely unhappy. The toddler used to spending far more time with his godfather/adopted father and honorary big brother. The only break in the family's routine during the month of December came on the 25th, when the entire family took the day off to celebrate the Christmas holiday. There was no training, no missions, no construction work, and not a single Namikaze clone anywhere in sight during the entire day. Gifts were exchanged, food was consumed, and Teddy was appeased. The rest of the village held its breath because a silent and unseen Namikaze meant applauding and pranking Namikaze in this day and age, and everyone was looking over their shoulders in worry. It was back to business as usual on Boxing Day, and while the Namikaze family felt far more relaxed than they had in months, the rest of the village kept watching over their collective shoulders for the expected prank that never came. The last few days of December passed fairly quickly for Harry, and he probably would have never noticed the end-of-year festivities if not for the fact that the entire village seemed to grind to a halt in order to celebrate. And there was much for the village to celebrate this year. The return of the Namikaze family had brought prosperity back to the village, along with a large influx of cash and ready work that revived the dying economy across the board. Shinobi and civilians alike shared the new prosperity equally, since the temporary jobs they generated were spread about evenly between both sectors, and the eventual permanent full and part-time jobs they would be offering would be similarly divided. The end of the year also marked the end of Harry's remedial academic classes, his education now on par with that of the average chunin. For Naruto, the end of the year marked the end of his time as the sole genin on Kakashi's team, as his new teammates were very carefully selected from the graduating academy students. His first teammate was a 14-year-old boy by the name of Ikeda Housei with short spiky hair, who preferred to dress in all black and wore mesh armor beneath his cloths. The kunoichi assigned to his team was 12-year-old Tanaka Midori. She had shoulder-length brown hair that she wore in a pair of low ponytails, and she wore dark blue pants that ended just below the knee with a light blue shirt that hung down to the middle of her thighs. Both older genin were orphans from the shinobi sector, meaning one or both of their parents had been shinobi before they died, and had never really interacted with Naruto prior to his 3-year trip to the outer countries. They were also fairly serious about their shinobi careers, were amongst the top students of their graduating class. And because neither of them were from a clan, both new genin could be molded and trained so that their skills would complement and support Naruto. Kakashi had actually spent 2 weeks observing those academy students slated to take the graduation exam in order to select the 2 individuals that would have the greatest chance of working well with Naruto, if only because he had no desire to draw Harry's ire should the teammates he picked attempt to bully or belittle Naruto. Naruto introduced both older genin to Harry through one of Harry's Kage Bunshin, because he hadn't been able to track down his cousin at the time, the same day he had been introduced to them. Harry would take the time to schedule a lunchtime meeting so he could meet the 2 kids properly about a week later, after he had a couple of clones watch the newly formed team's training sessions a couple of times. The wizard found himself approving Kakashi's choices and readily told Naruto that they would be welcome to join them for meals anytime so long as the blonde sent a clone ahead to warn the elves to keep out of sight. As the end of January drew near, Harry slowly began to lose contact with the wizarding world, his focus entirely on the new life he was creating for himself within the elemental countries. It didn't help that he barely had any time to write to any of the friends and family he'd left behind, though he had made it a point when he first arrived to diligently write everyone at least 1 letter a week, a task he'd taken to delegating to a clone due to how little free time he had. By the time January rolled around though, he'd taken to writing every other week and writing group letters as opposed to individual letters. His elves still brought him news every now and then as well, but their duties didn't really leave them much time to visit the wizarding world when they were outside of the barrier separating the elemental countries and the outer countries. Near the middle of February, Harry had made arrangements through Elf Post to convert another quarter of his vast fortune over to tradable commodities and Rio as he slowly began depositing his money into several accounts with the 3 local banks within the village, the Konoha Credit Union, the Bank of Konoha, and Hai no Kuni's National Bank. Each bank handled different accounts. The credit union handled Harry and Naruto's work accounts where they would deposit their shinobi paychecks and mission pay. The Bank of Konoha held the official Namake's family account and personal accounts for each member of the family, and the National Bank handled the business accounts for the Namake's family. Splitting his fortune up between the 3 banks and between the numerous accounts also had the benefit of making it harder for anyone to figure out just how rich the Namake's family was. That didn't include the wealth of commodities that Harry had stashed in a number of secret, and well-warded, hidey holes in each of the buildings their family now owned, or the ready pile of cash that the wizard kept on hand for their day-to-day needs. That also wasn't taking into consideration the not-so-small fortune that Harry had spent on building supplies and materials on both sides of the portal over the past 6 to 8 weeks, or the small fortune he'd forked out to purchase the apartment complex and the other properties. Harry would later regret losing touch with the wizarding world, but he had been so caught up in his new life and the freedom that had come with it that he did not immediately notice that he was drifting away from the world that had been his entire life for 8 years. Chapter 22, A Year in Review. Tuesday, December 31, 2002, late night. Konoha Gakure no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Naruto shared a grin with Housei and Midori as the 3 genin made themselves comfortable on one of the 3rd-floor balconies that overlooked the small yard that belonged to Namake's Wheelhouse, a very successful and very popular restaurant from the moment it had opened its doors to the public 5 months earlier. The small Namake's family was preparing to bring in the new year with their now traditional holiday display of fantastical fireworks. The employees that worked for the Wheelhouse, the Namake's Ranch, and the Namake's Orchard Farm had all been invited to join the family, as had Naruto's teammates, Harry's Jounin mentor, and a number of individuals that Harry and Arata had befriended. The party had started the moment the restaurant had closed its doors to the public at 8 sharp. Arata had closed the restaurant 2 hours earlier than usual for the occasion. There had been live entertainment, music and dancing, plenty of food and drinks, and a bunch of carnival games that had been set up in the small yard behind the building, for all of the children present. The fireworks were set to go off at exactly midnight, and all of the rear-facing balconies of the building, on all 3 of the top floors, were packed with those that had accepted the invitation. As he waited for midnight to roll around, Naruto reflected on everything that had changed over the past year. First, he'd not only finally met his new teammates but he'd quickly befriended them. All 3 of them had just clicked within the first few weeks as Kakashi-sensei trained them into the ground to turn them into a real team. Naruto was the team's heavy hitter and close-range fighter. Midori was a mid-range fighter with excellent accuracy when it came to Shuriken Jutsu and Doton Jutsu. The Kunoichi had an earth affinity, though it was currently untested. And Housei was the team's medic in training. He had excellent chakra control and was very knowledgeable when it came to first aid and long-range support. The D-ranked missions they took still sucked, but sharing the work with his teammates had made them far more bearable. After the first month, both Housei and Midori started hanging out more with Naruto after training and missions. By the end of the second month, both of them would spend 3 to 4 nights a week camping out with Naruto either beside the wagons or in his new bedroom once the renovations were completed at the end of March. By the 5th month, Harry had given both Housei and Midori permission to move into the family flat, going so far as to give them each their own room. His cousin often complained about the number of brats underfoot, but Naruto knew that Harry had grown rather fond of his 2 teammates and treated them like family because they were Naruto's friends and teammates, something both older genin appreciated. Then there was Kakashi-sensei. The man had become something of an uncle to Naruto during the weeks that they'd spent as a 2-man team, and that hadn't changed even after Housei and Midori joined them. In fact, both of the older genin looked up to the silver-haired man almost as much as they did Harry. Naruto knew that part of the reason he'd accepted Kakashi had been because of the stories that his father's ghost had told him about the Jounin, and that the rest of it was the fact that the man actually took the time to teach and train him. Of course, it didn't hurt that Harry got along reasonably well with the man, though they weren't exactly friends. The next change had been the slow and gradual change in attitude that Harry had gone through. When they first arrived, Harry had been tense and irritable, and Naruto knew it was because Harry was unhappy that he'd needed to bring Naruto back to the village that had hurt him so badly. The longer they stayed in the village though, The more relaxed Harry grew as it became obvious that the village had changed during the 3 years that Naruto had been absent. The fact that Harry was always so busy training, doing missions, and working with Arata to get everything set up also meant that his cousin had little energy left over to maintain his grudge against Konoha. It helped that there were no overzealous fans to hound him everywhere he went and no vindictive reporters tracking his every move hoping to rip his reputation apart. Harry had even made friends amongst the other shinobi over the past year, including Yamato, Iruka-sensei, Yuzuki Yugugo, whom Naruto was pretty certain was Umbu guard Nico and one of Harry's watchers, and oddly enough Nara Shikaku. His cousin was friendly with Kakashi, Mado Guy, and Marino Ibiki as well, but he wasn't exactly friends with any of them. He also got along alright with old man Tucci and his daughter Ayam from Ichiraku's, though Tucci seemed to disapprove of the fact that Harry was a single father. Or rather, Tucci disliked the fact that Ayam had a very obvious crush on his cousin. There were actually quite a few young women and teenaged girls that were mooning after Harry. Thankfully, they didn't follow Harry around and try to mob his cousin like the fangirls had back in England, but their giggles were still annoying and Harry still avoided them whenever as possible. The only girl that seemed determined to hate Harry and that Harry in turn ignored completely was Mitarashi Anko. Of course, Naruto's ongoing feud with the violent Kunoichi probably hadn't helped matters there, but the woman still hadn't apologized for attacking Harry and scaring Teddy. It had been more than a little amusing to see the uncomfortable look on Harry's face when most of the girls he knew, and more than a few he didn't know, had all given him chocolate for Valentine's Day. At the end of the day, Harry had stared at the massive pile of chocolate like it was some sort of monster. Naruto had then watched as Harry tested each and every single piece of chocolate for poison or drugs. That was also the day that he learned that a fangirl once tried to dose Harry with a love potion by giving him potion-laced sweets and that it was actually Ron that had eaten them and been caught by the potion. Once all of the chocolate had been found clean, Harry noted down the names of every girl that had given him something so that he could give them all friendship or thank you tokens in return on White Day. Harry then pawned most of the chocolates off on Naruto and told him to share it with his friends. In fact, Naruto knew that Harry had kept only one of the chocolate gifts he'd been given. He just had no clue whose gift he'd kept or why he'd chosen that particular gift to keep, whether it was because of who had given it to him or because of the gift itself. Teddy had changed a bit too. The 4-year-old had had a hard time adjusting to seeing so little of Naruto and Harry while both shinobi were training and working. Once Harry had enrolled Teddy in one of the better preschools, one that was most assuredly not associated with the Shinobi Academy. The younger boy had had an easier time dealing with the separation as he now had other children to distract him along with a chance to learn new things. Once the bulk of the work had been done in regards to the restaurant, the family apartments, and the new estate, Harry had more free time to spend with the family, and that had made the biggest difference in how quickly Teddy adjusted to life in Konoha. Then there was Arata and Eri's little daughter, Namake's Aika, who'd been born in the middle of the afternoon on May 30th. Aika had her mother's curly black hair and the Namake's trademark sapphire eyes, the very same shade as Naruto's. She was also undoubtedly a witch. Naruto couldn't believe how tiny Aika looked when she'd first been born, and he'd been scared to death of holding her out of fear he'd hurt her. All 3 adults had helped him get over that real quick, Harry providing a shadow clone henge to look exactly like Aika, while Arata and Eri instructed him on the proper way to hold a newborn. Naruto soon grew to love holding the little baby as much as he loved playing around with Teddy. The opening of the restaurant and the relative completion of the Namake's estate, which included the ranch, the orchard farm, the retreat, a relaxing place for any of the family to go for privacy, and the new training grounds, had been a big deal for the Namake's family. Getting things at the estate up and running signified that the Namake's family was in Konoha to stay, for better or for worse. The opening of the restaurant, and the completion of the living quarters above, only proved that they were serious about making Konoha their home. There was no doubt in Naruto's mind that the past year had been far better than he'd ever expected it to be. His biggest fear before they'd finally reached Konoha 15 months ago had been that things would be exactly the way they were when he'd left 3 years earlier. Seeing for himself just how much the village had changed had been an eye-opening experience. Sure, there were still a number of civilians that glared at him and occasionally insulted him, but things never went any further than that thanks to the new laws, Naruto's new last name, and his connection to the Yondaime, and largely thanks to Harry glaring and lambasting the offenders into submission. As Naruto's eyes were drawn to the night sky when the first rocket exploded outwards to form the burning image of a blue and white hippogriff, He supposed that the biggest change that had occurred over the past year was the fact that he'd once again began to consider Konoha home. He was also certain that the only reason he saw the village as home now was because he was no longer alone, and he'd come to understand that home would always be where his family lived. Tuesday, December 31, 2002, late night. Konoha Gakur no Sato, Hai no Kuni. 20-year-old Yuzuki Yugugo, aka Umbu Guard Nico, shifted minutely as she watched Namikaze Takashi double-check the rocket launchers that would fire the fireworks he'd prepared for the evening into the night sky. Since the day she'd been assigned as one of Takashi's watchers 15 months ago, she'd found herself slowly being drawn to the man despite her efforts to remain professionally aloof. There was just something about the green-eyed man that had captured her attention and firmly kept hold of it. At first, she'd thought her interest with the man had to do with the level of threat he represented to the village as an unknown entity. That assumption was proved false the moment it became apparent that her interest in the man continued to grow long after it became clear that the man wasn't a threat at all, unless you were stupid enough to piss him off by insulting or harming his family. Then she'd figured that maybe it was simply because the man was practically royalty due to his familial ties with the Sandaime Hokage and therefore a potential target for the Yandaime's old enemies. That too had been proven untrue as it became clear over time that the man was capable of not only protecting himself but his family as well. It wasn't until after her 4th month as one of Takashi's watchers that Yugugo finally admitted to herself that she was fascinated by the man's determination, drive, and dedication. The more she watched him, the more she wished to know him. She'd actually gone out of her way to avoid crossing his path while out of her mask for the first 6 months the man had been in the village, hoping that whatever it was that drew her to him would eventually vanish. It hadn't. She'd even given him chocolates on Valentine's Day, though she'd not put her name on the gift. She knew that her gift had been the only gift that he'd kept. She'd been on duty watching him at the time. She suspected the cat's silhouette etched onto the small squares of fancy candies had been enough of a clue for him to figure out who'd sent them. The beautifully sculpted chocolate cat, made from a mix of dark, milk, and white chocolate, that she received anonymously on White Day confirmed her suspicions. The crystallized emerald green sugar eyes gave it away, as did the fact that the cat looked like one of the strange lion-like cats that the Namikaze family kept as pets. She never did work up the courage to eat the beautiful creation. She had sealed it into a special storage scroll with a preservation seal instead. When she finally had stumbled across him without her mask and armor, she'd felt naked and vulnerable when his gem-like emerald eyes had locked with hers. It was not a feeling that Yugugo particularly enjoyed. She was a kunoichi after all, and she was not weak just because she was a woman. Just when the moment could have turned awkward, Takashi had smiled that crooked half-smile he tended to wear when he was pleased with something as he gave her a respectful nod and told her that she had beautiful hair and unforgettable eyes before he'd continued on his way. The kunoichi in her knew that the man had just blatantly revealed that he knew that she was one of his watchers, while the woman in her had preened under the sincere compliments. Now, Yugugo was not vain, but she was well aware that she was pretty. She'd never lacked attention from men wherever she went, especially from her fellow shinobi, since shinobi were often attracted to strong women whereas civilians were more often than not intimidated by them. She could easily have her pick of men and had on more than one occasion slept with those men that had caught her attention with their skills, their looks, or their unorthodox attempts to draw her interest. The purple-haired kunoichi had, in fact, been seriously entertaining the idea of hooking up with Geku Heiate on a more permanent basis around the time the Namikaze family had arrived in the village. She'd become rather close to Heiate during the months that he trained with her to help her improve her kenjutsu. All thoughts of entering into a relationship with Heiate had fled not long after she'd started watching Takashi. Heiate didn't hold her change of heart against her. He'd actually been the one who'd been the most hesitant about entering into a relationship with her due to the chronic illness he suffered from. Any time she'd mentioned the two of them going out, he'd mutter something about being cursed and her deserving happiness and a chance at a future. She'd been in the process of wearing him down, and if she'd not found herself distracted by Takashi, she probably would have been living with Heiate by now. She still trained with Heiate when she had time, and the two of them were still close friends. Yugugo just wasn't interested in him romantically any longer. In fact, Yugugo hadn't slept with any man since before she'd been assigned to Takashi's guard. Nor had any other man caught her eye, no matter how many had tried over the past year. No, for some inexplicable reason, Yugugo only had eyes for Takashi. And not just because he was easy on the eyes. The man was skilled, despite only being half-trained. He was intelligent, he had a twisted sense of humor. And he didn't take shit from anyone, not even from the loyal two members of the Sandaime or the Hokage. The second time she'd run into Takashi while off duty, she'd just stepped out of the market with a small bag of groceries when she'd been bowled over unexpectedly by someone ramming into the back of her knees. She'd wound up falling backwards over the perpetrator and spilling her groceries all over her, her attacker, and the ground. Thankfully, she'd not cracked her head on the ground or she'd have been in some serious trouble. Yugugo had growled under her breath and sat up just enough to glare at her attacker, who had been trapped under her legs, only to freeze the moment she saw familiar green eyes wide with fright set in a face that was white as a sheet and covered with raw eggs and eggshells. Naruto had skidded to a stop right beside the pair a second later to extract the strangely silent kid from beneath Yugugo, who hadn't known exactly how to react once she knew who'd knocked her over. She had been helped to her feet the moment Takashi's son had been lifted free by none other than Takashi himself before the man had gone on to clean up her spilled purchases. He then apologized for his son's recklessness and offered to replace those items that had been ruined, such as the eggs that had been smashed in her hair and on the kid. He'd even done something to clean her hair and clothes to get the egg out before it dried, which would have made it near impossible to get out. Yugugo didn't think she'd ever been so embarrassed in all her life. 2 days later, Namikaze Satoshi had shyly walked up to her carrying a handful of freshly picked wildflowers and a hand-drawn card that he gave to her along with a timid apology before he disappeared. She'd seen a second flash of blonde a little further down the street and suspected that it had been Naruto who prompted the child to apologize with the small homemade gift. From that day forward, she would continue to run into Takashi at least once a week when off duty, and he always offered a friendly smile and a polite greeting which she always returned. It wasn't until after Yamato had asked her for a favor that Yugugo really began spending time with the Namikaze family head while out of her mask. The favor turned out to be helping the green-eyed man with his kenjutsu, specifically pitting his style of fighting with a broadsword against a high-level katana user, which Yamato was not. She even ended up helping the man with his other sword fighting styles and taught him a few chakra-based attacks that could be used with a sword. In return, Takashi had offered to teach her how to fight with a sword from the back of a horse. Of course, she'd needed to learn how to ride a horse first. By the time she'd been deemed a competent enough rider to start learning to wield a sword on horseback, the two of them had become friends. There was no one day that she could look back on and say that that was the day she befriended Takashi, as the process of going from watchguard to training and sparring partner to friend had been a gradual one. In some ways, Yugugo felt like she'd been friends with the man for her entire life. It just felt right. And she couldn't find it in herself to regret befriending the slightly older man despite knowing that he was still on the Umbu watch list and that she was still required to monitor his every move 8 hours per day. She'd only made one attempt to have the Hokage remove her from Takashi's Umbu guard due to her unprofessional feelings for her charge, but the Sandaime had told her that he had faith in her ability to not let her feelings interfere with her duty, since a lesser shinobi would have tried to hide their attachment rather than step forward and admit to it. That had been 4 months ago, and the 20-year-old kunoichi had been irritated for days after that, right up until Takashi had thrust a small box wrapped in brown butcher's paper into her hands as he passed on her on the street. When she'd unwrapped and opened the box, she'd found a single serving of an unfamiliar chocolate creation. She debated for hours over whether or not to actually eat the gift or save it like she had the chocolate cat, but eventually caved when the heavenly scent of chocolate broke her resolve to resist indulging. Yugugo had never tasted anything so sinfully delicious. The different textures scattered throughout the delectable dessert combined with the warm, rich flavor of the different types of chocolates that formed the creation had been mind-blowing. By the time she'd finished the final bite, Yugugo had been almost 100% certain that the chocolate dessert had been better than sex when it came to washing away tension and frustration. The only complaint she had in regards to the treat had been the fact that it had only been a single serving. She would later learn that Takashi had been handing out free samples of the various desserts that the new Namikaze restaurant would be serving in the future to random people. She'd been a little upset that the gift hadn't been anything special until she learned that she was the only one who'd been given a sample of that sinful chocolate confection. She'd been further shocked to learn, from a conspiratorial airy, that Takashi had personally made the small cake he'd given her, unlike the rest of the dessert samples that had been made by their chefs. Sure, she'd heard Yamato practically rave about Takashi's cooking skills, especially when it came to camp food, but she'd been certain that her fellow Umbu guard had been exaggerating. Yugugo's attention was brought back to the present when the subject of her reflection turned to face her as he set off the first rocket and grinningly announced, "Happy New Year." "Happy New Year, Takashi," Yugugo replied as she gave the man an answering smile as she was bathed in blue and white light as the firework exploded in the air above them, all the while wondering just when her heart had given itself to the green-eyed shinobi and if there was a chance that he might be interested in her in a romantic sense. Tuesday, December 31, 2002, late night. Konoha Gakuer no Sato, Hai no Kuni, Yamaguchi Jiraiya, the Gama Sennin, one of the Densetsu no Sannin, renowned Fuinjutsu master, and self-proclaimed super pervert, made himself comfortable on the roof he determined would have the best view from which to indulge in his favorite pastime, people watching. And contrary to popular opinion, he didn't just utilize his people-watching skills to peep on naked women, though he certainly enjoyed watching naked women, every chance he got. No, Jiraiya was an expert at reading all people, regardless of their age or gender, and he'd become an expert by watching people from all walks of life doing every imaginable activity and a few not-so-imaginable activities. That ability coupled with the affable, open, and slightly naive persona he'd built for himself along with his in-your-face pervertedness was what made him an effective spy master. It also made it far easier for people to dismiss him as a hopeless has-been rather than a dangerous shinobi still in his prime. Of course, that approach rarely worked on those that were intimately familiar with his reputation as one of the Sannin. Jiraiya had prided himself on being good at what he did and took pride in the skills he'd learned and refined over the years. It had therefore been quite a blow to his ego when he'd been unable to find hide or hair of his missing godson after the kid had gone missing just a few months after his 8th birthday. There was nothing he hated more than failure. Failure meant that he lacked some essential skill. Failure meant that he still wasn't good enough. Failure meant that his precious people paid for his mistakes and weaknesses. No, there was nothing more he hated than failing. And in many ways, Naruto represented his biggest failures. He had failed to stop an enemy from ripping the Kyuubi out of Kushina. He had failed to stop Minato from sacrificing his life to reseal the Kyuubi. He'd failed to fulfill his duties as the boy's godfather, not that he'd had much choice at the time. He'd failed to make certain the kid was being properly taken care of whenever he was in the village. He'd failed to see the plots that were being carried out against the boy right under Sarutobi's nose. And he'd failed to find any sign of his missing godson outside of the village. Hell, he'd even failed to pick up on the fact that the little Gaki was back in Konoha until Sarutobi had summoned him back to the village roughly 15 months ago. Shoving aside that line of thinking, lest it lead him to depression and drowning his sorrows in sake, Jiraiya focused once more on the owners of the unexpectedly popular restaurant that had just opened up a few months earlier while his sharp eyes noted the number of people that had been invited to the Namikaze New Year celebration. Namikaze Arata looked like a washed-out copy of Minato with a rather friendly disposition and none of the spark that had defined Minato. That wasn't to say the man wasn't charismatic or outgoing. He just lacked that little special something that had set Minato apart from other shinobi his age. Part of that, Jiraiya supposed, could be attributed to the fact that Arata's chakra coils were damaged. The rest could easily be laid at the feet of his childhood. The man also wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty as he worked for his dreams and his future. Next was Arata's pretty little wife, the vivacious and friendly if slightly shy Namikaze Eri. She wasn't a stunning beauty or even a dangerous beauty, but she held a charm all her own. The young woman had made friends fairly easily once she'd settled into her new life in Konoha. It had also quickly become clear that Eri loved children, the way she doted on Naruto, Satoshi, and her newborn daughter every chance she got very obvious. Her interactions with the other young children that frequented the play parks where she took the young Satoshi to play were also very telling, as was the fact that she happily volunteered her time to help out at the preschool where Satoshi was currently enrolled. And then there was the enigmatic Namikaze Takashi. A man who looked nothing like a Namikaze but at the same time embodied everything that made a Namikaze. If Arata lacked Minato's spark, then Takashi had inherited that spark twice over. He was charismatic, intelligent, creative, hard-working, stubborn beyond belief, had a fearsome temper, was brimming with determination, and had a penchant for causing mass destruction and chaos. He was also mistrusting, highly skeptical, more than a little cynical, rather defensive, secretive, and difficult to read at times. And still a virgin at age 22, something that baffled and nearly horrified Jiraiya. It also amused him because he enjoyed teasing Takashi about his virginity. He wasn't certain that he liked the counter-pranking said teasing earned him in response. It had taken him months to get all of the pink dye out of his hair. And he had not enjoyed having his clothes dusted with a transparent and odorless itching powder. Waking up to find himself half naked, coated in green slime, and dangling upside down out of the left nostril of his sensei's face on the Hokage monument hadn't been all that thrilling either. Despite those incidents, Jiraiya still rather liked the prickly young man. Takashi's unorthodox approach to Fuinjutsu was also rather fascinating, and the man's innovative use of seals had stirred Jiraiya's own love of Fuinjutsu. In fact, every time Jiraiya had returned to the village over the past 15 months, he had sought out the younger man to talk shop with him and check out his latest projects. His favorite one was the special boots that allowed one to move safely over unstable surfaces without causing an unwanted level of noise or using an ungodly amount of chakra to make them work. His second favorite one was the specialized array that suppressed chakra signatures to the point where someone with large reserves was undetectable until you were practically on top of them. Then there were the rather impressive barriers that Takashi had put up around all of the Namikaze properties, including Minato's old house, that could prevent both the Byakugan and the Sharingan from spying on their properties. There was also a rather complex barrier that prevented those who wished to spy on the family or who meant the family harm from even setting foot on the property. In fact, those barriers had caught a spy from IWA that had been sent to confirm the small handful of rumors that had filtered out of the village about the return of the Namikaze clan about 5 months ago. The young head of the Namikaze family had not been impressed when he'd caught the spy and learned what he had been looking for. The man, who was a very experienced Jounin-level spy, had been a blubbering mess when Takashi had personally delivered him to Ibiki the next morning. According to what Jiraiya had read in Ibiki's report later, the man had begged to be allowed to confess to everything in exchange for protection from Namikaze Takashi. Takashi's report on the incident hadn't really shed any light on what he'd done to the man, and the 22-year-old had been tight-lipped about the matter. Though the feral smirk he'd flashed each time he'd been asked about the matter had said volumes, as had the cold look in the young man's eyes. Jiraiya sat up a bit, dug a bottle of sake and a saucer out of his vest, and poured himself a shot of sake as he tried not to think about the discussion he'd had with the young Chunin regarding Naruto's training, or more specifically, the look in Takashi's eyes during that discussion. Those leaf-green eyes had promised pain and humiliation beyond anything he'd ever experienced that was in direct contrast to the pleasant tone the man had used at the time. There had been a lot of words exchanged during that conversation, but it had all boiled down to one thing. If Jiraiya corrupted Naruto's innocence, if he in any way neglected Naruto's training, or if anything he did or failed to do was in any way responsible for Naruto being hurt, beyond the expected bruises and scrapes that were part of training, then Jiraiya was a dead man. Jiraiya knocked back his shot of sake and poured another as he contemplated the knife's edge he was now standing on, while his eyes remained fixed on the crowd of individuals packed into the balconies of the building less than 10 yards from where he was sitting. He decided, after watching the small Namikaze family for the past year, that he would wait another year before he took Naruto as his apprentice, a decision that had prompted his discussion with Takashi. His reasoning at the time was that he hadn't wanted to pull his godson away from his teammates when the boy was thriving under Kakashi's tutelage. Putting it off another year would also give him a chance to actually find something to teach the Gaki, seeing as how Minato's shade had taught the kid everything Jiraiya had planned to teach him, such as the Rasengan. He supposed he could let Naruto sign the Toad contract and teach him summoning, but that wouldn't take much. It certainly wouldn't necessitate the 2 or 3 year long journey that he'd originally intended to take his godson on while training him. That, of course, had been long before he'd met Naruto's overprotective and temperamental older cousin. In fact, Jiraiya suspected that Takashi would take exception to Jiraiya even thinking about removing the bewhiskered boy from the village for an extended training trip. Maybe I should consider breaking Naruto's training into smaller sessions, Jiraiya mused to himself as he poured a third shot of sake as the first firework of the night was launched into the sky, where it exploded into a blue and white mythical creature that pranced gracefully across the night sky. I could teach him a little something each time I'm in the village and take him out on short training trips to teach him those things that can only be taught outside of the village, such as how to draw out and use the Kyuubi's chakra, which is something that Takashi will also need to be trained in at some point as well. Yeah, he could work with that. Tuesday, December 31, 2002, late night. Konoha Gakure no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Namikaze Arata, formerly Dudley Desley, wrapped his arm around his beautiful wife's shoulder as she leaned into his side. Their precious little Ika cradled in Aries' arms as they cuddled on the couch he'd moved out onto their private balcony to watch the firework display. Reaching out to gently brush his fingers through Aika's silky black locks, Arata couldn't help but think that he was the luckiest man alive. He had a beautiful wife, a beautiful daughter, was the half-owner and manager of what was promising to be a successful restaurant, lived in a luxurious apartment that he owned jointly with his cousin, and his past reputation as a bully had not followed him to his new life. Yes, putting his life in the hands of his cousin had been the best decision that he'd ever made. He also knew that he'd in no way taken the easy road in life. He'd busted his ass to get where he was now, and he'd done it without a single word of complaint. Having Eri's constant support and encouragement over his efforts and decisions certainly hadn't hurt either. The old Dudley never would have made it this far. He would not have wasted the energy to work for something he felt he deserved to be handed to him on a silver platter. The old Dudley had died over the course of his 5th and 6th years at Smelting's Academy though. His parents had never understood what had happened to him in the summer before his 5th year, when those Dementor things had forced him to relive his worst memories and nearly sucked out his soul. They'd constantly fought against the changes he was going through as he grew up and matured out of their sight during the 2 school years following that horrid attack. The year they'd spent in protective custody while Harry risked his life to end the magical war had been full of revelations as well. The first of which had been the way his eyes had been opened to just how bigoted and short-sighted his parents really were. Seeing his parents repeat history the day that Naruto turned up on their doorstep out of the blue had been the final straw for Arata. He refused to stand by and allow his parents to abuse another child. The decision to contact Harry for help had set off the chain of events that had led him to his current point in life, and Arata knew that he owed both of his younger cousins more than just simple gratitude for their acceptance of him. By rights, Harry should have hexed him black and blue for daring to ask him for help because of the trouble that his parents were attempting to stir up. That Harry hadn't turned his back on him, laughed in his face, or cursed him in some way only emphasized that his cousin had always been the better man despite the way the Dursleys had treated him, or maybe it was just despite the Dursleys. Either way, Arata appreciated the fact that his cousin had not only given him a chance but had accepted him as family. His precious Eloise, his Eri, had praised him for his courage. If not for Eri, he didn't think he'd have had the courage to approach Harry in the first place. It had been the need to protect his then-girlfriend from his parents that had made him swallow his pride and ignore his insecurities in order to ask Harry for help. And help them Harry had. The wizard hadn't just given him handouts to solve his problems though. No, Harry had given Arata something far more precious than mere money, a chance to truly make something of himself. The year and a half of intense education had been hard but worth it as he worked towards the dream he shared with Eri of their future. He couldn't count the number of times he'd feared that he'd never be good enough for Eri, that he'd fail her in some way, but those fears had not come to pass. There had also been times when he feared that Harry's trust in him had been misplaced and that the wizard would come to regret ever agreeing to help Arata, but he hadn't. In fact, the more time that the two of them spent together, the more comfortable the two of them became with one another. Arata had also found that his trust in Harry hadn't been misplaced either. Harry had never once looked down on him for any reason. He'd never threatened to cut him off if the two of them had a disagreement. He also never tried to give Arata the short end of the stick when it came to their partnership. Arata had had an equal say in all matters regarding the restaurant and their family, even if Harry had the final word in their family. The wizard had stepped forward as the head of the family right from the start. Something Arata didn't mind despite the fact that he was a month older than Harry. It helped that Harry listened to everyone's suggestions and did what was best for the family, not just what was best for Harry. This past year had really opened his eyes to just how far Harry would go for family. The wizard-turned-shinobi had driven himself into the ground day in and day out in order to do what had to be done to see the family taken care of in their new home. That was on top of everything his cousin had to do to ensure that their place in Konoha wasn't jeopardized, which included subjecting himself to what Arata considered rather brutal training that pushed Harry to his limits more often than not. The only reason why Arata hadn't stepped in was because he knew that his cousin had known exactly what he'd been getting into the moment he'd decided to take up the life of a shinobi. Arata did ensure that Naruto wasn't being similarly driven into the ground. The rambunctious blonde was thriving though, especially now that he had a couple of friends near his own age that he trained with and hung out with after and between missions. That those friends had quickly become part of their family had not really been all that surprising to Arata given Naruto's open and friendly personality coupled with his uncanny ability to form connections to the people with whom he interacted over a relatively short period of time. Yet another thing that Naruto had in common with Harry. Kakashi had turned out to be very mindful of both Naruto's age and Harry's temper. Arata thought the older man did rather well considering just how protective Harry had become of their mutual cousin over the years. Unlike Harry, who didn't really have time to get to know the silver-haired Jounin, Arata had befriended the somewhat antisocial man halfway through the previous year. They had bonded over one of Naruto's more memorable pranks, where said blonde had managed to turn Mitarashi Enko's trench coat pink with bright yellow flowers, put her hair into pigtails, paint her face with makeup to make her look like a little kid, and swap out her favorite kunai for an overly cute purple teddy bear. Kakashi had actually watched Naruto pull off the prank while Arata had observed all of the planning and work that had gone into final product. The other friends that Arata had made had all been from the civilian sector, Kanzaki Tuchi and his daughter Iam, the manager of the Bank of Konoha, the owners of several markets, some of the men he'd hired to renovate the apartment complex that Harry had purchased, a few of their neighbors that had appreciated the fact that they were cleaning up the decrepit apartment building, and several of their employees. The only reason why he didn't have more friends from the shinobi sector was due to the fact that most of the people he interacted with were civilians while Harry was the one that tended to deal with the shinobi. Things on the business front had been just as well as those in this personal life, if not better. Harry had managed to procure the deed to the perfect property, even if it had needed to be completely gutted and practically rebuilt from the ground up. The wizard had then managed to find them some prime real estate for the farm they discussed running in order to grow a selection of produce that was either not found in the elemental countries or that was too expensive to import into Konoha on a regular basis. The Namikaze's name and the Potter Black fortune had then opened all kinds of doors for them as they set to work building their future. That had been Arata's time to shine as he put his hard-won education to work on top of getting his hands dirty in order to turn the building that he and Harry had purchased into the restaurant it was now. Sure, Harry had been in the background helping when and where he could, but it had been Arata that had managed everything to make certain they didn't miss or skip an important step. Harry had done a share of the work as well. His wife had added the finishing touches that gave the restaurant its rustic ambience. Interviewing prospective employees and seeing to it that they were given the training they needed had been a headache and a half. Those that thought themselves above needing training and those that caused trouble with the majority of the other employees, or with the family, didn't last very long. Thankfully, most of the people that they ended up hiring were willing to cooperate though, and after weeks of training and preparation they worked really well together. Thinking about his employees, Arata absently recalled all of the times he'd heard his father badmouth the people he worked with, and the 22-year-old wondered how his father had managed to hold on to his job for so long with his deplorable attitude. Arata's ruminations were interrupted at that point when the first rocket was launched into the sky to paint the heavens with blue and white light that depicted a large creature that was half horse and half eagle. He then turned to the side to give his wife a chaste kiss as he wished her a happy new year. A second kiss was placed upon the brow of his sleeping daughter a heartbeat later. Yeah, he was happy with his lot in life. Very happy. Chapter 23, Re-Evaluation. Saturday, April 5, 2003, all day. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Harry let his eyes run over the familiar faces of the Jounin panel that had conducted his initial physical assessment and fought the urge to scorn beneath the contemplative gazes that were being leveled at him. It had been 18 months to the day since he'd given his oath to the Hokage and officially joined the shinobi forces, and he was due to have his skills re-evaluated to determine whether or not he'd improved over the past year and a half. In addition to the assessment panel, there were quite a few off-duty shinobi that planned to watch him show off again scattered about the edges of the training ground, including Naruto and his two teammates. "Are you ready, my youthful friend?" Guy inquired once the last member of the panel arrived, Kakashi running late, as usual. "Hi," Harry replied as he focused his attention on the eccentric taijutsu master and shifted into a defensive stance. 2 seconds later, the Jounin was flying at Harry as their spar officially began. Unlike the first time that Harry had fought the Jounin, Harry wasn't caught off guard by the man's speed. The wizard had grown used to seeing shinobi move at superhuman speeds during the long months in the village. The other difference this time was that Harry had a far better grounding in taijutsu basics thanks to all of the training spars that Yamato had put him through. On top of that, he'd had the opportunity to spar with a number of different individuals that allowed him to gain a better grasp on how to use the Mizuken Ryu against different styles to better effect. His physical conditioning and stamina had also improved over the intervening months, which allowed Harry to last far longer against the stronger Jounin than he had the first time he'd faced the man. Harry even managed to get in a few hits this time, whereas before he'd not managed to hit the man at all. After 48 minutes, Guy called an end to the match when Harry's form started growing slightly sloppy, a sign of his encroaching exhaustion. Harry still ended up with some pretty impressive bruises from the match, but they didn't really bother him all that much since his pain tolerance, which had always been high, had only grown since he first became a shinobi. For his shuriken jutsu assessment, Genma once again started by having Harry attempt to hit him with kunai and shuriken, though this time the man used a shadow clone to provide Harry with multiple targets. Harry hadn't spent as much time working with the throwing weapons, but Yamato had given him tips to improve his accuracy, something that showed as Genma was forced to use the substitution jutsu a couple of times to escape injury. At the end of 10 minutes, Genma and his clone turned the tables on Harry without warning, and Harry once again was on the receiving end of a barrage of sharp and pointy objects. Harry spent 5 minutes catching both kunai and shuriken before he started using the weapons he caught to deflect the unending flood of kunai, shuriken, and senbon. He even managed to dispel the man's clone rather than just remaining on the defensive, a reflection of how accustomed he'd become to fighting with live weapons in a spar during his training sessions. The ability to turn an opponent's weapons against them was a skill that could save his life in the future, and something that Yamato had been quick to point out to him the first time the two of them had sparred using the throwing weapons during his training sessions. At the end of the second 10-minute period, Harry was grinning like a loon once more, as he'd enjoyed the heated match just as much as he'd enjoyed it the first time around. He almost wished he'd had a chance to spar with Genma during the past 18 months, as the man was by far the most talented shinobi he'd come across when it came to shuriken jutsu. Harry received his first 10-minute break at that point as the scattered weapons were gathered up from the field, Harry summoning his personal weapons using the recall runes he had stitched in his cloak pockets, which were tied directly to the runes he'd carved onto his weapons, while Genma was forced to gather his the old-fashioned way. His kenjutsu spar with Hayama only lasted a half an hour without any breaks, and only focused on his skills using a tanto, a katana, and his dual wielding with both two wakizashi blades and with a traditional daisho. He also demonstrated the long-range kenjutsu attacks that Yugugo had taught him. He was still no match for Hayama, and he walked away from the spar with more than a few cuts and bruises where he hadn't blocked or dodged fast enough. He was at least content with the knowledge that his sword work had improved over the past 7 or 8 months. If he'd been allowed to use his broadsword during the spar, he'd have done even better, but the assessment panel already knew he could effectively use the western blade. Shizun healed his injuries once the spar was over, and then Harry took another 10-minute break before he demonstrated the jutsu that he'd learned over the past 18 months. Those included the Doton jutsu that Yamato had taught him to clear the land of rocks, to till the land, and to level the land, as well as the wind and water attacks that he'd been taught after the Jounin had tested his chakra affinities, which were strangely enough not exactly the same as his magical affinities, which were wind and fire, wind being the only common element between the two energies. At the end of the demonstration, Harry would face both Kakashi and Yamato in an all-out ninjutsu spar. Unlike his first all-out spar with Kakashi, Harry's memories of the war were not stirred. He also allowed himself to use far more magic in the 2-on-1 match than he had previously, a reflection of the fact that the wizard no longer mistrusted the entire village the same way he had when he first arrived. He still didn't demonstrate the full range of his magical skills, but that was simply because there were far too many shinobi present, and shinobi were some of the biggest gossips that Harry had ever met, and he'd known Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, the gossip twins of Hogwarts. 2 hours later, the training ground was once again a huge mess, and all three men were exhausted. Harry had pushed Yamato and Kakashi just as much as they'd pushed him. It wasn't that he'd gotten that much stronger, although he had grown during the past year and a half, it was that his physical stamina had improved. His chakra control had gotten better, even if it still wasn't perfect, and the experience he'd gained from sparring against different shinobi during his training had allowed him to develop a better fighting strategy. The weekly appointments with Tsunade had also reduced a significant amount of the internal stress he'd been suffering from due to his body still adjusting to the crude expansion of his chakra coils and the sealing of the QB inside of him. Expending large amounts of chakra regularly had been a double-edged sword, as while it helped reduce the amount of chakra in his coils, it also placed stress on his coils. Much like running hot water over a burn irritates the injured skin and nerves. Of course, if he had stopped using his chakra in order to allow his coils to heal, then he'd have only made the damage worse because of the constant influx of converted demon chakra steadily increasing his reserves. Demonstration and assessment over, the crowd dispersed, with those that had seen Harry's original assessment verbally commenting on the differences between both assessments, to those that had not been present at the first one. Harry was told to be in the Hokage's office at 9 sharp on Monday morning to hear the results of his re-evaluation, before he was ordered to help repair the clearing he'd helped destroy. Yamato and Kakashi both took a soldier pill to restore their chakra reserves while Harry sighed and started the repairs with his magic. The wizard not allowed to use chemical aids to bolster his depleted chakra reserves due to the risk of overloading his coils thanks to Kyuubi's presence. It only took a half an hour for the three of them to restore the training ground with Kakashi and Yamato doing most of the work. Naruto, who'd stuck around alongside of his teammates, dragged Harry off to their shared flat the moment the clearing had been repaired. Harry was rather amused that all three children were currently correcting each other in regards to which skill of his had been the most awesome. Housei was adamant that Harry's kenjutsu skills were the best, while Midori insisted that Harry's ability to catch kunai and shuriken was better, and Naruto firmly argued that it was Harry's ninjutsu that had been awesome. Harry dryly reminded all three of them that all skills had their uses, even the boring ones. Harry spent the rest of the weekend lazing about, a rarity for the wizard as there was no work for him to do on any of the Namake's properties and he'd been given the time off from missions and training. Teddy greatly appreciated having his undivided attention for most of Sunday, the two of them alternating between playing, studying, and practicing magic, Harry seeking to help Teddy improve his control over his metamorphmagus abilities using the suggested exercises that Andromeda had outlined for him, prior to her death. Monday, April 7, 2003, morning, Konoha Gakur no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Hirozen glanced down at the evaluation summary of Namake's Takashi's most recent assessment while he waited for the young man in question to arrive for their meeting. Name, Namake's Takashi. Age, 22. Height, 5 feet 6 inches. Weight, 170 pounds. Kekkei Genkai, unnamed, alternative/secondary energy. Description: the full extent of the abilities of the still unnamed Kekkei Genkai are unknown but currently include an increased healing factor. Provides the user with an increase in stamina and endurance, speak with/summon the spirits of the dead, manipulate and combine any element regardless of the user's actual chakra affinities. Examples include ice and lava, speak the language of serpents. Physically alter their base form at will. This ability is specific to Takashi's son, create or summon objects from thin air, and it purportedly prevents a user from breaking an oath. Note, the unnamed Kekkei Genkai has been revealed to be a secondary energy source that is not related in any way to chakra. A few words that have been used to describe this ability are versatility, unpredictability, sentience/intuitiveness, willpower, raw power, responsibility, belief/confidence, balance, healing/health, and death. Stats: current, previous. Stamina, 5.0, 5.0. Speed, 3.0, 2.5. Force, 2.5, 2.0. Taijutsu, 2.5, 2.0. Ninjutsu, 3.75, 3.0. Genjutsu, 0.0, 0.0. Fuinjutsu, 2.5, 2.5, not retested. Kenjutsu, 4.5, 4.0. Shurikenjutsu, 3.25, 2.5. Intelligence, 4.5, 4.5, not retested. Total ability, May 31, 36 including. LP, 28.0/32.5 including. LP, 3.15 average/3.6 including. LP, 2.8 average/3.25 including. LP, latent potential, LP 4.5, 4.5, unchanged. Luck, 5.0/-5.0, Namake's luck has shown a disturbing tendency to invert itself without warning. The exact reason for the inversion has remained unclear and the pattern that the inversions follow is currently unpredictable. Chakra rating, Kage level reserves, low Chunin level control, skill levels, physical condition, low to mid Chunin, weapons handling, low Jounin, battlefield strategy, high Jounin, overall ranking, high Chunin. Comments: Namake's is a Jinchuriki, Bijou, Kyuubi, has maintained an uncommonly high level of situational awareness on the battlefield, still doesn't know when to quit, excessively stubborn, showed an improvement in regards to personal safety, retained the ability to think on his feet, and increased his ability to adapt his battlefield strategies in order to counter his opponent's tactics. He still has a wealth of untapped potential that could be brought out so long as he continues to receive proper training. Namake's has started to place his trust in authority figures, providing they are honest and straightforward with him. He has demonstrated a measure of loyalty to the village that did not exist previously, though he is still loyal to his family first and foremost. He is also still highly protective of his family, but the chances of him physically harming those that annoy him have decreased significantly. It is my firm belief that Namikaze no longer poses any threat to the village, and his behavior and change in attitude over the past 18 months has indicated that the man is well on his way to considering Konoha his home. The lack of hostility from the civilians towards the two Namikaze children, particularly towards Naruto, has played a huge factor in Namikaze's change of attitude. Recommendations: I recommend that Namikaze be placed on a proper 4-man squad in order to give him experience in working with other members of the shinobi force and to give him a chance to build additional bonds above those he formed over the past 18 months. I believe that Namikaze will benefit from taking higher-level missions, both inside and outside of the village, that will allow him to surpass his current limits and offer a greater chance of him reaching his full potential. The risks involved in allowing him to leave the village are little different than those that all shinobi face when they step outside of the walls on a mission, bar the chance of him crossing paths with one of Manito's old enemies. Namikaze would also greatly benefit from some structured lessons in Fuinjutsu, as he has shown a rare intuitiveness and inventiveness when it comes to the sealing arts. It has also been noted that the young man uses some highly unorthodox seal combinations on top of using a number of unfamiliar seals that potentially originated from Namikaze's land of birth and might be powered through his still unnamed Kekii Genkai. Examples of Namikaze's seal work to date include an extensive barrier over each of the Namikaze properties that can block the interior from both the Byakugan and the Sharingan and alerts Namikaze to intruders, specialized shoes that allow one to traverse unstable ground, such as sand or snow, without the need to expend chakra or use a variation of the water walking exercise, and a chakra dampening field that can cloak a person's chakra reserves and render them mostly invisible to sensors and sensory jutsu. Lastly, while Namikaze has shown marked improvement both mentally and emotionally since he first arrived, I highly recommend that his monthly meetings with Ibiki not be stopped at this point. The therapy sessions have proven to be highly beneficial in reducing the stress and tension that was noted during earlier evaluations. Reducing the number of meetings per year should not impact their usefulness, providing that Namikaze attends a minimum of 4 sessions per year and schedules additional sessions upon completion of any high-level mission with a high risk factor, or in the event that a mission fails, for any reason. Shikaku. Hiruzen was actually more than a little surprised that the man had improved as much as he had over the past 18 months, if only because it was almost unheard of for someone of Takashi's age to experience such notable growth over such a short time frame. That was especially true when one considered how late in life Takashi began his shinobi training, at age 19, a full 13 years after most potential shinobi begin their training. There were moments when Hiruzen wondered just how powerful the young head of the Namikaze family would be if he'd started his training around age 6. He also wondered if there was any chance the man would allow his son to join the academy when he turned 6. The Sandaime closed the file and set it to one side before he picked up the active shinobi roster to scan through the list of Chunin-level shinobi that were currently not assigned to a 4-man team. Most of those that fell in that category were unfortunately assigned to teach at the academy, worked in the Cipher division, or were currently assigned to the T&I department. It would do Hiruzen no good to assign 2 village-bound shinobi to Yamato's team. The Sandaime had decided to keep Takashi under the Mokutan user's supervision because they worked well together, since Yamato would shortly be taking Takashi out of the village on missions. There were actually only 4 potential teammates that had the skills necessary to join Yamato's team. Unfortunately, selecting which pair would be placed on the team was not an easy task, since the 4 individuals in question were from 2 different teams that were short-handed, and splitting up the pairings would only create more problems. Then there was the fact that the first pair, Endo Hayes and Uda Oke *, were both 5 years younger than Takashi, and the second pair, Higane Kotetsu and Kamizuki Izumo, were consummate pranksters. Hiruzen wasn't certain how Takashi would react to having younger teammates, due to his distaste for what he saw as child soldiers, but he wasn't certain he wanted to place 3 known pranksters all on one team. That was just asking for trouble. After a slight hesitation, he made a decision on which pair he would assign to Yamato's team based upon skill alone, rather than on age or personality, and prayed that he wouldn't regret it later. Decision made, Hiruzen dropped the roster back on his desk, wrote a short note of explanation to the chosen pair, so they would be aware of what was going on, and sent one of his guards with said letter to fetch the 2 individuals that he'd selected. The smoke from the masked shinobi's exit hadn't quite dissipated before his current secretary knocked on the door to announce that Yamato and Namikaze Takashi had arrived for their meeting. Hiruzen promptly asked the man to send the pair in, and less than a minute later, Hiruzen found himself studying Takashi as the man strode into his office on the heels of the jounin that he'd assigned to train the chunin. The young shinobi still exuded a presence that demanded attention and still moved with the natural grace of a stalking tiger, though the man's tightly leashed power was no longer quite so easy to sense. Part of that was due to the intensive training that the jounin Hiruzen had assigned to mind the man had put him through, and part due to the man having far better control of his emotions. It helped that Takashi's former rage over the injustices that Naruto suffered earlier in life had been calmed thanks to the worst of the offenders being weeded from the village long before the Namikaze family arrived, and that very few people still directed their hate at the younger Jinchuriki. It was the relaxed contentedness that clung to the man like a second skin that soothed Hiruzen's earlier concerns about the man, though. Over the course of the past 18 months, Takashi had shed the negativity and hostility he'd worn like a second skin the day he arrived. The effort that he, and several of his most loyal shinobi, had put into making the entire Namikaze family feel welcome had produced the exact results that Hiruzen had been looking for. Namikaze Takashi and Namikaze Naruto, and by extension the rest of their small family, had come to consider Konoha home. That Takashi and Naruto were both dedicated shinobi that were without a doubt loyal, to a certain degree, to the village they had been watched closely over the past year and a half, was a bonus in the Sandaime's eyes. Yes, taking a chance on Namikaze Takashi had been one of the best decisions that Hiruzen had made in the past 12 years. Hiruzen shelved his musings as the pair slowed to a stop in front of his desk and offered him a respectful bow before they both offered a polite, "Ohayou gozaimasu, Hokage-sama." "Ohayou, gentlemen," Hiruzen returned before he focused on the sole chunin present. "I spent most of yesterday reviewing your file and comparing the results from your most recent assessment with the results of the assessment that you were given when you first arrived. I am pleased with the progress that you have made over the past 18 months. The imbalances that were originally noted in your skills have mostly been corrected, and those that remain are minor enough to work around so long as you continue to work as hard as you have been this past year and a half. Additional experience on a wider range of missions will also undoubtedly help reduce those imbalances further. Your physical health, specifically the condition of your chakra network, has improved drastically, and Tsunade's most recent report indicated that the amount of damage and stress the influx of demonic chakra inflicts upon your coils on a weekly basis has begun to taper off, a clear indication that your chakra network has nearly finished adapting to the Bijuu's presence. Tsunade believes that the process will be complete sometime within the next 12 to 18 months, and that so long as you continue to regularly expend large amount of chakra on a daily basis and continue to see her once a week for the duration of that time, there is little risk of your coils shattering due to the stress. Ibiki's monthly reports on your mental and emotional health have indicated that the severity of your PTSD has been reduced to more manageable levels. I was also happy to learn that your anger management issues haven't been as much of an issue over the past 6 months, and that your tendency to lash out verbally, or physically in rare cases, at those that annoy you has been drastically reduced. I'd like for you to continue visiting Ibiki on a monthly basis for the next 8 months, and if you continue to show marked improvements at the end of those 8 months, then the number of times you will be required to meet with Ibiki will be reduced to between 4 and 6 per year rather than the current 12. Do you have any questions about your results or comments that you wish to make, Takashi? Hiruzen inquired as he eyed the young man for signs of tension or displeasure. He would find none. Not at this time, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen nodded in response before he declared, after careful consideration, Chunin Namikaze Takashi, I have decided to officially assign you to a 4-man squad. You will also be removed from the watch list now that it has been determined that you are not a threat to the village, though you can expect to be monitored from time to time over the next 2 years. A knock at the door interrupted the meeting at that point, and 15 seconds later, the 2 individuals he'd selected to join Yamato's team entered the office. Perfect timing, gentlemen, I was just about to mention the 2 of you by name. Takashi, please allow me to introduce you to your new teammates, Higane Kotetsu and Kamizuki Izumo. Kotetsu, Izumo, I believe the 2 of you are familiar with Namikaze Takashi. The 3 of you will be forming a new team under the leadership of Jounin Yamato. The 4 of you will have the next 6 to 10 weeks in which to work on your teamwork before Team Yamato is cleared for missions outside of the village. The Hokage almost smiled when he saw the surprise flit across Takashi's face as the young man briefly glanced his way before returning his gaze to the two older chunin that had been assigned to his team. The twin smirks on Kotetsu and Izumo's faces didn't bode well for Hiruzen's sanity, but it was a little late now to change his mind. He also didn't miss the doleful glare that Yamato had directed his way the moment the young jounin had learned the identity of the two additional chunin that had been assigned to his team. Hiruzen hoped that the former Umbu guard would eventually forgive him for assigning the two pranksters to the team that Yamato had agreed to lead. Skill-wise, the two men had been the only logical pair to place on the team since their abilities were ranked between high chunin and low jounin, while the other pairs' skills had been between low and mid chunin. The older duo was also easygoing and outgoing enough to get along with most anyone, which increased the chances that Takashi would not have any problems working with the pair. "Are there any questions, gentlemen?" Hiruzen asked once it became obvious that the three chunin finished inspecting one another. "No. Then the four of you are dismissed." Hiruzen watched the four men file out of his office before he turned his attention to the paperwork that needed to be done to finalize the formation of the new team. Once he completed that, he pushed all thoughts of Namikaze Takashi from his mind as he moved on to the next item on his agenda for the day. Monday, April 7, 2003, morning. Konoha Gakur no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Yamato was sorely tempted to use his control over wood to form sharp splinters on the Hokage's desk and chair in retaliation for assigning the two pranksters to his team. The only reason he didn't was the fact that Kotetsu and Izumo were actually a good match for Takashi, so long as the duo didn't start a prank war with the younger chunin. Takashi rarely ever pulled any pranks, but when he did, he went to great lengths to let the person on the receiving end of the prank know that they'd irritated him. The only exception was when the man was pranking Naruto or his son. Those pranks were always intended to be fun and amusing for both the pranker and the prankee. The moment the door to the Hokage's office closed behind the newly formed team, Yamato asked, "I already know that Takashi cleared his schedule for the day, but do either of you have previous commitments you need to take care of, or are you free to join us for the rest of the day?" "We've nothing pressing that needs our attention," Izumo declared after holding a short, silent conversation with Kotetsu with naught but a glance. "In that case, I'd like to spend the rest of the morning sparring in order to see where the two of you stand, skill-wise, and to allow the three of you a chance to familiarize yourselves with one another's fighting styles. After that, we can sit down and discuss a training schedule for the next 6 weeks and set aside time for team missions." "Sounds like fun," Kotetsu remarked with a slight smirk. "Most definitely," Izumo agreed with an identical smirk. "I hope you're both good at dodging and running. Yamato-san's idea of sparring requires a lot of legwork." Takashi interjected absently as he tucked his hands in his pockets and began walking in the direction of the training ground that the two of them usually trained in. "That's because you needed the practice to improve your speed," Yamato pointed out with a soft snort as he fell into step with him and the other two followed in their wake. "Really? I thought it was because you were still mad over the prank that Naruto played on you." Yamato snorted again. "You and I both know that you were the one that came up with that prank on top of helping the Gaki pull it off by leading me right into it. Of course I helped my Otoko. What kind of role model would I be if I didn't help and encourage Naruto to improve himself? Or worse, discouraged him from enjoying such a harmless hobby while improving his stealth capabilities and planning skills at the same time?" Takashi demanded in a scandalous tone. "I think this is the start of a beautiful friendship," Kotetsu drawled in a tone that made Yamato want to bash his head against the nearest tree. "You took the words right out of my mouth, Tetsu-chan," Izumo eagerly agreed, and Yamato began to seriously consider the length, sharpness, and number of the splinters he intended to grow on the seat of the Hokage's chair. The group arrived at Training Ground 16, the same clearing that Takashi had claimed over a year ago, just a few minutes later, and Yamato promptly set the other three to sparring in an all-out melee in order to get an idea of Kotetsu and Izumo's skills as well as get a feel for how well the trio would work together. He didn't fail to notice that the two older chunin tended to gang up on Takashi, out of habit since they'd been teammates for over 10 years now, instead of fighting one another. Yamato smirked when Takashi took away that advantage from the pair when he created a dozen Kage Bunshin and had 8 of them henge into copies of Kotetsu and Izumo to confuse the pranksters. Once the pair was separated and the two originals lost amongst the clones along with the original Takashi, the fight turned into the free-for-all that it was meant to be, and temporary alliances rose and fell with each strike. The Jounin called an end to the spar half an hour later and asked Takashi to dispel his clones. He nearly groaned when the smoke cleared to reveal Kotetsu and two Izumos standing in the clearing. The two Izumos immediately began arguing over who was the real Izumo while Kotetsu merely smirked. Yamato let them have 5 minutes to play around before he ordered the fake to drop his henge. He was more than a little surprised when the fake Izumo was revealed to be Kotetsu, while the Kotetsu who'd been standing off to the side smirking had actually been Takeshi. All three of the Chunin had cracked up over that, and Yamato glowered at the trio as he began making plans to sneak into the Hokage's office to grow splinters, lots of splinters that would be strategically placed for optimal pain. Up in the Hokage's office, the Hokage felt a wave of immense dread wash over him, and he shivered beneath his hat as he briefly wondered just who he'd pissed off this time. That's it for part 6. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.